Welcome to Cosmic Wand. Today's adventure. Harry was executed by his own order and woke on the day he got his Hogwarts letter. If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The execution. They built the scaffold in the same courtyard where they had once crowned him. Harry knew the flagstones. He had bled on them during the last siege, holding the inner ward while the Death Eaters broke against it like surf, and afterward the survivors had carried him here on their shoulders and called him the thing that won. The stone remembered. He could feel the old ward still humming under the frost, weak now, half dismantled, the way a house feels after the family that loved it has gone. It was dawn. The sky over the ministry's high atrium was the color of a bruise 3 days old. They had chained him to a black iron ring set fresh into the floor, fresh, because the courtyard had never been meant to hold a man for killing. There were 200 of them in the galleries above, maybe more, ranged along the tiered stone like a congregation. He had saved most of them. He could put names to 100 faces without trying. That was the part they had not understood when they planned this. They thought the chains and the gallery and the severance would make him afraid. The man does not fear the people he has carried out of fire. He only learns very precisely what they are. The severance came first. 3 of them performed it, robed in the gray of the Department of Mysteries, and they would not look at him while they worked. They drew the rite on the flagstones in chalk and silver and a powder that smelled of cold iron, and when the circle closed, Harry felt the first of his magic peel away from him like skin off a burn. It did not hurt the way they must have hoped. It was worse and quieter than that. It was the sensation of a door he had walked through every day of his life being bricked over from the far side while he watched. He had killed the Dark Lord with the magic they were taking. He had ended a war with it. They knew that. It was why they had spent 2 years in the better part of the unspeakables, research building a rite that could pull it out of him root and filament, because the ordinary way of killing a man does not work on a man who is harder to kill than the people sent to do it. The gray-robed unspeakable nearest him faltered on the last sigil. Her hand shook. He recognized her, Marlowe, who had lost a daughter at the Battle of the Causeway and whom he had pulled unconscious from the flooded undercroft beneath it. She had wept into his shoulder that night and called him a blessing. "You don't have to finish it," Harry said. His voice came out level. It surprised him a little even now how level. "You can put the chalk down and walk up those stairs and no one will stop you." Marlowe finished the sigil, so that was answered. A memory came up through the cold while the rite worked, unbidden, the way drowning men are said to see their lives. Not the whole of it, one field. The causeway, the night the line nearly broke, the undercroft flooding, and 100 of the Order's people trapped between black water and a Death Eater spearhead, and Harry walking out alone onto the broken stone to buy them the minutes they needed. They had a name for him by then. The Sable, the rank and file called him, half in fear and half in love, the black edge that the Dark Lord's people learned to run from. He had hated the name and answered to it anyway, because a frightened army needs something to believe in, and he had been the only thing on offer. He had held the causeway until dawn. He had pulled Marlowe out of the black water with his own hands. And the thing he understood now, kneeling in chalk while Marlowe's daughter's killer's verdict was read over him, was that the name had been the beginning of the courtyard. The moment they made him into the Sable was the moment they made him into a thing, and a thing, however beloved, is only ever kept until it is no longer convenient to keep. The last of his magic went out like a lamp in a sealed room, and the world dimmed in a way that had nothing to do with the light. Sound flattened. The frost on the flagstones stopped being a thing he could taste. For the first time since he was 11 years old, he was only a body, ordinary and breakable, kneeling on cold stone with iron on his wrists. Then they brought the parchment. Kingsley Shacklebolt carried it himself, which Harry supposed was meant as a kind of honor. The Minister for Magic had grown old in the war and older in the peace. His beard was iron-gray now, his shoulders carried like a man who had given up the habit of straightening them. He unrolled the parchment with both hands and read in the deep, slow voice that had once steadied 100 terrified recruits in a forward camp. Harry James Potter, a breath. By the joint authority of the Wisengamot and the Council of the Order of the Phoenix, convened in extraordinary session, you are found to be a clear and present danger to the magical world that cannot be contained by ward, by oath, or by law. Kingsley's eyes stayed on the parchment. You have been judged too dangerous to live. Sentence is death, to be carried out at the rising of the sun. The courtyard was very quiet. Somewhere in the high galleries a child began to cry and was hushed. Harry looked at the parchment, not at Kingsley. He had spent enough of his life reading the room and the man both. The man was a coward dressed as a statesman, and there was nothing in him worth the cost of contempt. The parchment was the thing that mattered. He knew that hand. The body of the order was written in a clerk's anonymous copper plate, but the rite of severance appended below it, the specifications, the failsafe sequence, the elegant, cruel cleverness of a spell built to strip a wizard of the one thing that made him a wizard before they killed the meat that was left. It had been drafted by someone whose handwriting he had read across 10 years of letters and battle plans and notes shoved under his door at 3 in the morning, when she'd cracked some problem the rest of them had called unsolvable. Hermione Granger had designed the thing that was killing him. He found her in the gallery without meaning to. She stood near the front between two oars, her hair gone early to gray at the temples, and she was looking at a point on the flagstones a yard to the left of his knees. She had argued for it, he understood now. Of course she had. She would have done the calculus. Hermione always did the calculus, and weighed the realm against the man and decided the realm came first, and then she would have insisted on designing the right herself, because if it had to be done, it should be done correctly, cleanly, without unnecessary suffering. She had built him a merciful murder. It would have kept her up at night. She would have told herself that mattered. Beside her, half a step back, Ron Weasley looked at the wall. Harry waited for him to look down. Ron had stood at his left shoulder through Hogwarts and 3 years of running and the whole long grinding war, and there had been a stretch in the middle of it, in the worst of the bad years, when the two of them had been the only thing each other had. Harry watched him and waited and gave him every second he could, and Ron looked at the wall above the scaffold with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, and he did not look down, and that was its own kind of answer, and it was the only one Harry got. He stopped waiting. There is a discipline to dying that no one teaches you because no one expects you to need it more than once. Harry had learned it in the war, had felt the moment come and pass a dozen times on a dozen fields, the door swinging open and then, against the odds, swinging shut. You do not spend the last of it screaming, you spend it seeing. You take the whole shape of the thing into yourself clean, so that whatever comes after, you go into it carrying the truth and not a comfortable lie. So Harry saw. He saw 200 faces he had saved, arranged to watch him die and grateful that someone else had done the deciding. He saw Kingsley rolling the parchment with the relief of a man setting down a weight. He saw Hermione looking at the floor and Ron looking at the wall. He saw the executioner come forward, hooded, anonymous, the coward's mercy of a face you would never have to remember, and lift a wand that was not Harry's wand, because Harry's wand had been snapped on the steps of the Wisengamot a week ago to a sound like a green branch breaking. He saw all of it. He did not look away from any of it. And in the last clear second before the green came, the thought that filled him was not fear and was not even grief. It was a verdict of his own. Never again. Not one of you, never again will I bleed for a thing that decides when the bleeding's done that I am the danger. I gave you everything. You took it and then you took me. I will not make that trade twice. The executioner's mouth moved. The light came. The killing curse is supposed to be the end of thought. There is no spell in the world more honest about what it does. It does not wound or burn or break. It simply unmakes the difference between a person and a thing, and the unmaking is instantaneous, and there is nothing on the other side of it but the dark. That is true for everyone. It had never quite been true for Harry Potter. The green struck him, and for the length of a heartbeat, the courtyard and the gallery and the iron and the chalk all held perfectly like a held breath, and then the severance, which had peeled away every working scrap of his magic, reached the bottom of him and found the thing it had not been built to take. The thing none of them had known was there to take, because it was not magic in any sense the unspeakables had a word for. It was older than the rite and older than the Wisengamot and older, very probably, than wands. He was the master of death. He had been since the night in the forest, a lifetime and a war ago, when he had walked to his own murder with 3 deathless things gathered to his hand and let the dark take him and been allowed to come back. He had never wanted the title. He had spent years pretending he did not have it. But a thing does not stop being true because you decline to look at it, and now, at the bottom of him, where the severance had stripped away everything that could be stripped, the curse met the one thing in the wide world that could not be killed because it was, in some sense the living are not built to hold, already on the far side of killing. And the dark, which had come for him, recognized its own. This is the part there are no good words for, so the words will have to be the wrong kind. The courtyard came apart not like glass and not like smoke, but the way a reflection comes apart when the water it is written on is touched. And underneath it, under the flagstones, under the bruise-colored sky, under the whole bright shallow film of the morning he was being murdered in, there was the other thing, and the other thing had been there the entire time, and it was vast. He stood, or the part of him that was past standing stood, in a cathedral with no light in it, not darkness. Darkness is the absence of light, and a thing has to be capable of light before its absence means anything, and this place had never been touched by the concept. It went up. He understood that it went up the way you understand the depth of water you are drowning in, not by seeing it, but by the pressure of it, the sheer accumulated weight of it pressing down on the small warm fact of him. Columns rose into it if they were columns, ranked away in every direction past counting, and each of them was an hour, and the hours were numberless, and they held up nothing because there was nothing above them but more of the same forever. This was where time was kept, not measured, kept the way grain is kept, the way the dead are kept. Every hour that had ever been stood here in its column, patient, finished, filed in the dark against a use no living thing was meant to know. And something in it turned its attention to him. He felt it the way the inside of an eye feels the sun. There was no face. He was grateful afterward, in the place where gratitude was still possible, that there had been no face, because a face he could have argued with, and there was no arguing with this. It was the cold under all the other colds. It was the temperature of the gap between the columns, the temperature at the bottom of the severance, the temperature he would spend the rest of a second life unable to entirely get warm against. It was not cruel. He understood that immediately and completely. It was not kind. Cruelty and kindness are appetites, and this had no appetite, because everything that exists comes to it eventually, and it has only to wait. It was the patience of a tide for a sandcastle. It regarded him, its master, who had been brought low by the small, loud creatures whose hours it kept, and it did a thing it had perhaps never done, and perhaps did all the time, there being no way for a mind built of one direction to know which. It offered him a column. He did not choose with words. There were no words down there. Words are an hour-bound thing, a thing of before and after, and the cathedral was all of when at once. He chose the way you flinch from a flame before thought, with the whole animal certainty of him, and the certainty was the verdict he had carried into the green. Not like that, not their version of me, spent and discarded. Take me back far enough that I am no one's weapon yet. Take me back to before I gave the first piece of it away. The attention considered, there was a price. He knew there was a price, the way you know in a dream, the rules of the dream, without being told, beneath telling. He could not have named it. He understood only that the cathedral did not give, that nothing in all those numberless patient hours was ever given, that everything here was lent, and that a debt taken in this place would be collected in this place at an hour of its choosing, in a coin he did not yet have a hand to count. He took the loan anyway. A man being murdered does not haggle. Had time, while the attention considered him, to understand one more thing about the place he had fallen into, and it was the thing he would carry longest. The cathedral was not a punishment, and it was not a reward. It simply was the way the bottom of the sea is, the way the cold between stars is, a fact so much larger than the small, warm arguments of the living that the living had built 1,000 religions rather than look at it straight. The dead did not suffer here. They did not rest here either. They were kept in their columns, finished and entire, neither at peace nor in torment, only done, and the doneness of them was the most enormous thing he had ever stood inside. He had spent his first life being told that death was the great enemy, the thing to be feared and fought, and by the cleverest cheated. Standing at the bottom of the world among the kept hours of everyone who had ever been, he understood that death was not an enemy. It did not care enough to be an enemy. It was the floor under the floor, and he, alone of all the numberless kept, was being permitted to stand back up off it, not because he had earned it, not because he was loved, but because of an old accident in a forest and a title he had never asked for, and because the floor under the floor had, for reasons of its own, decided to let its master go a second time. The cold moved through him once, root to crown, the way the severance had, but backward, putting back what the right had stripped, and more, and older. And then the column it had offered him closed over him like deep water closing over stone, and the cathedral folded and folded and folded again, every hour collapsing into the one before it, the whole vast filed dark rushing backward down a throat that had no bottom, and Harry Potter fell up the years with his memory clenched in both fists like the one thing worth saving from a burning house. He did not let go of it. That was the only thing he did. Falling through every hour he had ever lived, in reverse, faster than thought and then faster than that, the war unhappening, the friends undying and the friends unbetraying, the green light uncast, the title unearned, the boy he had been ungrowing toward the child he had been, he held on to the truth. He let the cathedral take everything else. The cold could have the rest, but he came up out of the deep dark clutching the one cargo no second life is supposed to be allowed. I know what they are, I know what they do. I know exactly when each of them does it. The attention released him, and somewhere far above, an hour opened to let him through. Harry Potter woke in the cupboard under the stairs. He knew it before he opened his eyes by the smell, dust and old polish and the particular mildew of the wall against his face, a smell he had not breathed in 20 years and had never once in all that time missed. The cot was too short. His feet hit the slatted wood of the door. There was a spider working a web in the corner above the single high vent, exactly where a spider had always worked a web, and the light coming through the vent was the thin gray of very early morning. He lay still and took inventory, as he had learned to wake on 100 mornings when waking wrong meant dying. Body first. It was wrong. It was small. His arms, when he raised them in front of his face, were a child's arms, thin, scabbed at one elbow, the wrists with no weight to them at all. His hands had no calluses. The long pale seam that had run across his left palm since the Battle of the Causeway was gone, the skin under it unbroken and new. He pressed 2 fingers to his own sternum and felt his heart going quick and light and untired, a child's heart, a heart that had never been asked to keep a grown man alive through things grown men do not survive. He sat up. His head did not reach the underside of the stairs the way it had at the end. The cupboard was enormous around him, the way the world is enormous when you are very small in it. He held up his hands again and looked at them in the gray light and made himself believe it. There was no grief in him. He noted the absence with the detachment of a physician taking his own pulse. He had expected grief for the body he'd earned, for the friends who in this place in this hour were not yet traitors and could not be grieved, for the whole burned-down world that no longer existed because it had not happened yet. But grief is a door closing, and Harry's door had closed in the courtyard, between Ron's averted face and the green. There was nothing left in him to slam. What there was instead was a flat, clean stillness, the stillness of a man who has been to the bottom of the worst thing and come back up and now has, against every law he knows, a second deal of the cards. And under the stillness, quiet, the cold that was not the cupboard's cold, the temperature of the gap between the columns, it had come back with him. He understood that he would carry it now. The attention had not stayed, he could feel that it had not, that he was alone in his own skull in a way he had half feared he would not be, but it had left a thumbprint, a chill at the very base of him, a reminder in a language with one word, and the word was Lent. He breathed out. Down the hall, beyond the cupboard door, a brass clock he could not see began to chime, and he counted it without thinking. 6. On the floor above, the bed springs of his aunt and uncle's room creaked under Vernon's bulk, and a moment later the floor took the heavier impact of his feet, and the pipes shuddered as the upstairs tap came on. Ordinary house sounds, sounds from a morning 20 years dead. He reached up and touched the underside of the stairs, the rough, unfinished wood an inch above where his head would have been if he stood, and he pressed his palm flat against it and let himself, for exactly one breath, feel the size of what had happened. Then he took his hand down. There was a date he needed to confirm, and a piece of paper that would confirm it, and after that there was a great deal to do and a finite number of years in which to do it. And Harry James Potter, who had been the Order's blade and the war's edge, and at the very end, the thing the people he saved decided they could not afford to let live, had never in either of his lives been a man who lay in the dark wondering at a thing when he could get up and learn it instead. He knew the date. He had asked the cathedral for it without words, and the cathedral had answered. But knowing and confirming are different countries, and a man who builds on the first instead of the second is a man who builds on sand, and Harry had a war to build, and he intended to build it on stone this time. He swung his two short legs off the cot, and the spider in the corner went still, and Harry Potter, 11 years old, smiled in the dark for the first time in 20 years. It was not a nice smile. It did not have anything to do with happiness. It was the smile of a man who has been handed back the board he lost, with every piece still on it, and who already knows where his opponent's hands will move. "All right," he said softly, to the cupboard, to the cold at the base of him, to the 200 faces in a gallery that would not exist for 2 decades. "All right," from the top. The first letter would come today. He was certain of the date now in the way you are certain of a wound, by the specifics. July the 24th. He had not thought of the exact day in 20 years, but the cathedral had handed it back to him whole, and now that he had it he found 100 small confirmations waiting. Dudley's birthday had been the month before. He could hear it in the new whine of self-importance in his cousin's voice through the cupboard door. The zoo trip, the snake, the vanished glass already happened. Mrs. Figg's broken leg already happened. The letter then today. He knew exactly how the next several weeks would go because he had lived them, and because for the first time he had the man's understanding to lay over the boy's memory. The Dursleys would intercept the first letter. Vernon would block the cupboard's mail slot of a door, then move him to Dudley's second bedroom, then board the windows, then flee, the hotel, the rock in the sea, the howling night, and Hagrid coming through the door with a pink umbrella and a birthday cake. He remembered all of it. As a child he had experienced it as chaos, as a door blown open onto a world he had not known existed. As a man he saw the machine of it, a sequence, predictable, exploitable. The question was whether to let it run. Harry sat on the cot with his elbows on his knees and his chin on his laced fingers, and he thought about it as the war had taught him to think about everything. Not what do I want, which is a child's question, but what does this buy, and what does it cost, and who is watching? Letting the siege run as it had cost him nothing he could not afford. A month of Vernon's pettiness was a triviality to a man who had survived a year in a tent in the wilderness with the whole world's Death Eaters hunting him. It gained him 3 things. It kept the timeline legible. Every event that happened the way he remembered it was a fixed point he could navigate by, and a man with a map should not burn the map for the satisfaction of an early shortcut. It kept him invisible. The moment he behaved like something other than a frightened, ignorant 11-year-old, eyes would turn toward him, and there were eyes he very much did not want turned toward him yet. And it brought Hagrid, and Hagrid brought the doorway into the magical world, and there were things Harry needed from that doorway that he could not get any other way. There was a 4th thing, quieter, and he made himself look at it squarely because a man who will not look at his own motives is a man who can be moved by them. Letting it run meant seeing Hagrid again. The half-giant had died at the Battle of the Causeway, had stood in the breach with a broken spear and bought the retreat with his enormous life, and Harry had not been able to reach him in time, and it was one of perhaps 4 deaths in the whole war that Harry had never once managed to set down. Hagrid was alive this morning. Hagrid would come through a door in a week's time, soaked and enormous and kind, and he would have no idea that the silent black-haired boy he was rescuing had carried his death for 20 years. Harry noted the feeling. he did not indulge it. But he did not pretend it wasn't there either, because the whole architecture of his second life was going to be built on the difference between the men who had spent him and the handful who had simply, uncomplicatedly been good to him, and Rubeus Haggard was first on the short list of the second kind. He would let the siege run. He would play the part, the wonder, the fear, the hunger of a starved boy seeing the world for the first time. He had been an actor longer than he had been anything else. The Dursleys had taught him to perform smallness before he could read, and the war had taught him to perform whatever a situation required, and the role of bewildered 11-year-old was, frankly, beneath his abilities. He could do it in his sleep. He intended to do it awake, watching everything, giving nothing. But there were two changes he would make, small ones, invisible to anyone who wasn't him. The first was the snake. He had spoken to the boa constrictor at the zoo a month ago, and he had thought nothing of it then, and Dumbledore had thought a great deal of it later. Parseltongue. The mark of the thing Voldemort had put in him as an infant, the fragment of soul lodged behind his scar that had let him talk to serpents and feel the Dark Lord's moods, and in the end walk into the forest to die so the fragment could die with him. That was old news. He could not unspeak to the snake. But he could be careful going forward about who saw him do it, and he could begin today the long, quiet work of learning to feel the fragment's edges, because a man who shares his skull with a piece of his enemy had better know exactly where the borders lie. He reached for it now, gently, the way you probe a sore tooth with your tongue. And there, behind the scar, behind the bone, in a place that had no anatomy, it was, smaller than he remembered, dormant. A coiled cold sliver of something that was not him, sleeping, because its master was a wraith drinking unicorn blood in a forest 400 miles north and had not yet found the strength to stir. Harry held his attention against it for a moment, and the sliver did not wake, and he withdrew. It would keep. It would, in fact, be useful, but that was a thought for a later and a quieter hour. The second change was Mrs. Figg. Urbella Figg, the batty cat lady 3 streets over, who had minded him a dozen times across his childhood and bored him half to death with photographs of tabbies. She was a squib, and she was Dumbledore's, posted in Little Winging for the single purpose of watching Harry Potter and reporting what she saw. He had not known that as a child. He had learned it years into the war in an offhand remark, and it had landed on him like a slap. That the old man had been watching him since before he could walk, that there had never been a day of his miserable childhood that had not been in some sense supervised, not protected, supervised, the distinction precise and damning, by the architect who was even now, 400 miles north in a tower full of whirring silver instruments, arranging the pieces of a boy's life toward a use the boy would not understand until he was dying for it. Harry was not going to do anything about Mrs. Figg. That was the point. He had brought her up to himself precisely so he could decide deliberately to do nothing. Because the instinct, the hot animal instinct, was to start tearing out the architect's eyes one informant at a time. And that instinct was exactly the kind of thing that would get him noticed, and a noticed weapon is a controlled weapon, and a controlled weapon ends up chained to an iron ring in a courtyard at dawn. No, he would smile at Mrs. Figg. He would look at the photographs of her cats. He would be precisely as forgettable to her as he had been the first time, and she would write Dumbledore precisely the same letters she had written before, and the architect, reading them, would believe his board was set as he had left it. Let him believe it. Belief was the most exploitable thing in the world. A fist hammered on the cupboard door and the whole frame jumped, and Vernon's voice came through it like a foghorn through a wall. Up, are you up? Get up and see to the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. Harry held still for the space of a breath, and in that breath something happened that he had not entirely planned, and that told him more about the shape of his second life than all his careful reasoning had. The old reflex moved through him, the cupboard reflex, the bone-deep flinch that 20 years of cupboard mornings had welded into the child's nervous system he was now wearing. His heart kicked. His shoulders started to come up around his ears. The body remembered being afraid of the man on the other side of that door, and for half a second the body's memory was louder than the mind that knew better. And then the man inside the boy looked at the reflex calmly from a great height and let it pass through him and out the other side without touching him. Vernon Dursley, 300 stone of red-faced suburban cruelty, a man whose entire power over Harry had been the power of an adult over a starved and friendless child. Harry had stood in front of Voldemort, he had stood in front of the Wizengamot, he had knelt in chains and watched a friend refuse to look at him and felt nothing he could not master. Vernon Dursley was a frightened, stupid, ordinary man, and the only thing that had ever made him terrible was that the boy in the cupboard had no measure to set him against. Harry had a measure now. He had every measure. "Coming, Uncle Vernon," he said, and his child's voice came out exactly right, a little sullen, a little cowed, the voice of a boy who has learned that the fastest way through the morning is to be small and quick and unnoticed. Pitch perfect. Vernon grunted and stamped off toward the kitchen, satisfied, and Harry sat for one more moment in the dark with the wrongness of his small body and the cold at the base of his spine and the enormous closed door of the future on the other side of the cupboard, and he made the first real decision of his second life. He was not going to be the boy in the cupboard. That boy had grown up to be the Order's weapon, and the weapon had grown up to be a body chained to a ring, and the whole grinding inevitability of it had begun right here, in this dark, with a starved child learning to make himself small for cruel men. The chain of it ran straight from this cupboard to that courtyard, link by link, and every link was a moment when Harry Potter had handed a piece of himself to someone who would one day decide to keep it. He was going to break the chain at the first. Not loudly, not yet. The performance would hold, the siege would run, Hagrid would come, and Diagon Alley would open, and the architect's board would look exactly as the architect had said it. But underneath the performance, beginning this morning in the dark, Harry Potter was going to start playing a game that no one else at the table knew had begun. He would extend no loyalty on credit. He would owe no one his obedience for the accident of having been put in charge of him. He would smile and flinch and burn the bacon just brown enough, and he would watch, and he would remember, and when the moment came, when each of them reached, in their turn, for the piece of him they thought was theirs to take, he would already have his hand on the board. He pushed open the cupboard door. The hallway was bright and ordinary and smelled of Petunia's air freshener, and number 4 Privet Drive lay around him exactly as it had 20 years ago, a small dull box of a house in a small dull box of a street, the unlikeliest possible birthplace for the thing he was about to become. He went to see to the bacon. He did not burn it. He had decided, somewhere between the cupboard and the kitchen, that he would not give Vernon even the satisfaction of a thing to punish, because a man who is watching for the long game does not waste moves on the comfort of small defiance. He fried the bacon to the exact shade of brown that would draw no comment, and he set it on the plates, and he stood at the counter in the morning sun while Dudley counted his birthday leftover money at the table and Vernon read the paper and Petunia fussed at the marmalade. And he watched them, the small, cruel, ordinary family that had been handed a wizard to raise and had chosen, with great consistency, to be unkind to him. He felt nothing for them either. That was worth noting. Once, even in the war, he had carried a low-banked anger at the Dursleys, the resentment any child carries who is unloved by the people charged with loving him. It was gone. They had been the first to spend him in their petty way, the first to look at the strange boy in their care, and decide that what he was made him a thing to be managed rather than a person to be raised. But they were so far beneath the scale of what had been done to him since that the old resentment couldn't survive the comparison. They were ants. He had been executed by gods or by people who had let him make them into gods, which came to the same thing. The ants did not matter. What mattered was the post. It came at 7:30, the flap of the front door's letterbox clacking, and Dudley was sent to fetch it and came back with the bills and a postcard from Marge and one stiff envelope of heavy yellowish parchment. And Harry, flipping bacon, invisible at the counter, felt the whole hinge of his second life turn on the sound of that flap. "Dad," said Dudley, holding the parchment envelope up by one corner like it might bite. "There's a weird one. It's got Harry's name on it." The kitchen went very still. Harry kept his back to the room. He kept his shoulders down and his breathing even and his face arranged in the mild blankness of a boy who has learned not to want things in front of the people who will take them away. But inside, where the cold lived, he reached out and touched the moment as it turned, and he held it because this was it. This was the first card off the top of the deck, the first move of the new game, the doorway swinging open exactly on schedule. He had walked through this doorway once before and let the world on the other side of it decide what he was. He was not going to make that mistake twice. "Give that here," said Vernon, in the strangled voice of a man whose worst fear has just been pushed through his own front door, and his hand came down over the parchment and crushed the address out of sight. And the siege of number 4 Privet Drive began for the second time in the history of the world, except that this time at the counter, with his back turned and his face blank and the bacon hissing in the pan, the boy it was being waged over was 20 years older than the man trying to win it. And he was already 3 moves ahead, and he was, very quietly, exactly where he wanted to be. Let it run, he thought, let all of it run. He turned the bacon. He did not let it burn. And 400 miles to the north, in a circular office full of spinning silver instruments and the soft snores of a phoenix, one of those instruments, a delicate thing of glass and silver that had measured the well-being of a particular boy for 10 uneventful years, gave a single quiet chime and shivered and went still again, and the old man asleep in the chair beside it did not wake and did not see the needle that had swung for one impossible instant all the way across the dial and back. Something had come home to Privet Drive that morning that had not been there the night before. The instrument did not have the words for it. Instruments rarely do. But the cold at the base of a boy's spine knew exactly what it was, and the boy who carried the cold turned the bacon and waited and began. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, 11 again. By the third day of the siege, Harry had proved to his own satisfaction that the world was real. He had not taken it on faith. A man who builds his second life on the assumption that he is not dreaming or dead or being shown a kindly lie by the thing in the cathedral is a man who deserves whatever he wakes into, and Harry had spent the first 72 hours testing the proposition from every angle he could reach without giving himself away. The body was the first proof, and the most persuasive, because the body knew things he had forgotten. When Vernon shoved him into the cupboard the first night and threw the bolt, Harry's grown mind catalogued the indignity and set it aside, but the boy's stomach growled at exactly the hour it had always growled, and the particular ache of the cot's wooden slat against his hip was an ache he had not felt in 20 years and could not possibly have invented. Memory smooths things, the body does not. A dream would have given him a softer cot, or no cot, or skipped the part where his feet went cold because the cupboard had never been heated. The cot was too short and the cot was real. The light was the second proof. He lay in the dark on the second night and watched the thin gray line under the door go from black to charcoal to the flat white of a Surrey morning, and he timed it against the milk float that came at 6:20 and the paper that came at 6:30 and the first car backing out of a driveway at 6:45, and every sound landed where his memory said it should, and the world did not have the seams a constructed world has. He had been inside constructed places. Late in the war, the enemy had learned to grow them pocket illusions, false rooms baited to hold a raiding party while the real trap closed elsewhere, and they always failed in the same way in the small repeated details, the door that opened onto the same hallway twice, the clock that ticked but did not advance, privet drive advanced, the milk float never came twice, the cold was the third proof and it was not a comfortable one. It sat at the base of him, below the place where his magic lived, and it had not faded in 3 days. He had half expected it to be a residue of the rewind, a thing that would burn off like fog as the new life took hold. It had not. When he reached down to examine it, and he had learned across 2 lifetimes that a man should examine the things inside himself before they examine him, he found it exactly as it had been in the cupboard on the first morning. A chill that was not the cupboard's, a temperature borrowed from a place with no temperature, a single quiet pressure at the floor of him that meant Lent. The attention was gone. He was alone in his skull, he had confirmed that much, probing the corners of his own mind for any sign of a passenger, and finding only the old familiar furniture and the one cold sliver behind his scar that had always been there. But the cold the cathedral had left was not a passenger. It was a marker. A debt does not need to watch you to be owed. He decided he could live with it. He had carried worse and stranger things. And there was a use in it. Even a man who carries a small permanent reminder of the floor under the floor is a man who does not get drunk on his own cleverness, and Harry intended to be very clever in the coming years and had no intention of getting drunk on any of it. So, the world was real. He was 11. He had every memory of a war that had not happened and a murder that would not now happen, and he had on the far side of the cupboard door a finite and precious number of years in which to make certain that neither ever did. It was time to find out what he could do. He had been putting off the question of magic, and he made himself notice that he had been putting it off, because a man who avoids a test is a man who already suspects the answer. The fear was simple. The severance had taken his magic, had peeled it off him filament by filament in a courtyard at dawn, and even though he knew intellectually that the rewind had put it back, that the cathedral's cold tide had run through him root to crown and restored what the right had stripped, there was a part of him, a deep animal part, that remembered the lamp going out in the sealed room, and was afraid to reach for the switch in case the switch was gone. He reached for it anyway on the 4th night in the dark of the cupboard with the house asleep above him. He did not try anything large. He had learned magic the second time around the way soldiers learn it, fast, brutal, under fire, but he had learned its grammar long before that in this very year, and he knew that the first lesson of accidental magic is that it answers intent, not incantation. A wandless, wordless wizard cannot do much. But he can do a little if he wants the little badly enough and knows precisely the shape of what he wants, and Harry had spent 2 decades learning to want things with a precision that would have frightened his teachers. He held out his hand in the dark and wanted light, not a spell. He had no wand and would not have one for weeks, and the incantations were for channeling, for focus, for the careful shaping of a force that wanted to sprawl. He simply held the wand in front of him, clean and specific, a point of pale light here above my palm the size of a marble, cool, steady, and he pushed his attention into it the way you lean your weight into a stuck door. The light came. It came faster than it had any business coming. For a child of 11, the first deliberate wandless light should have been a flicker, a guttering ghost of an ember that died the moment the concentration wavered. Harry's came up clean and held, a pale steady globe the size of a marble, cool as he had asked, hanging an inch above his palm and lighting the cupboard's underside of stairs and the spider's abandoned web in his own thin child's wrist, and it did not gutter and it did not die, and he held it there for a slow 10 count and then let it go, and the dark came back. He sat with that. He had expected the magic to be there. He had not expected it to be trained. But of course it was. He saw it the moment the light held, because the limit on a young wizard's power is not the size of the well. It is the strength and steadiness of the hand on the bucket, and Harry was wearing an 11-year-old's well with a war veteran's hand. The core was a child's core, shallow and quick to tire. He could feel that the marble of light had cost him more than it should, and that a sustained working would empty him fast. But the control was the control of a man who had cast under torture, cast while bleeding out, cast with the wrong wand and no wand and a snapped wand, cast 10,000 times in conditions designed to break concentration. The bucket was small, the hand was a master's, and a master's hand on a small bucket draws water more cleanly than a fool's hand on a deep well. This changed the arithmetic. He had assumed he would spend the first 2 or 3 years rebuilding, that the gap between what he knew and what his body could do would be a long, frustrating climb. It would still be a climb, the core would have to grow, and cores grow at the speed they grow and not faster, and he would not be casting battle magic at 11 no matter how cleanly his hand moved. But the climb would be steep and fast, because every scrap of capacity his growing core gave him, he could put immediately to use with a precision the rest of his yearmates would not reach until they were grown, if they reached it at all. He lit the marble again and held it and turned his hand slowly under it, and watched the light slide over the new unscarred skin of his own palm. One sensory thing in the dark, the faint warmthless glow of it, cold light on cold skin, the only light in the box he was kept in. He thought, with no particular drama, that the people who had built the courtyard would not have built it if they had understood what they were teaching him every time they made him fight. They had forged the sable in fire and then been afraid of the edge they got. They had no idea that the edge survived the breaking of the wand and the stripping of the magic and the green light and the floor under the floor. They had no idea that the edge was awake this morning in a cupboard in Surrey, 11 years old and already sharper than anything they would ever again be able to break. He let the light go. Tomorrow he would test the limits in daylight away from the house. For tonight he had what he needed: proof of the body, proof of the world, proof of the magic. The deal was real. The board was set. He slept and did not dream of the courtyard, because the door to the courtyard had closed, and Harry did not waste sleep on closed doors. The next day they moved him to Dudley's second bedroom, and the change of cell turned out to be the gift he needed. It happened because the letters had begun arriving by the dozen, slithering under the door of the cupboard and down the chimney and through the cracks of the house, and Vernon, in the deranged logic of a man losing a war to stationery, had decided that giving the boy a room with a proper door might somehow stem the tide. So Harry was installed upstairs among the wreckage of Dudley's discarded things: the broken television, the birdcage with the dead parakeet long gone, the shelves of toys snapped in tantrums, and for the first time in his life he had 4 walls and a window and a door he could shut, and the freedom in the long unwatched hours to find out what he was. He used the daylight to push past the marble of light. By morning he could hold 2 points of light at once, one above each palm, and steer them around the room like slow cold fireflies, and the doubling cost him roughly what he'd expected: the child's core draining toward empty faster than any adult's would, a tiredness that came on like a tide and had to be respected. He learned the edge of it quickly. A man who does not know where his own limit is will find it at the worst possible moment, and Harry mapped the limit now in safety, the way you sound a channel before you sail it. He pushed until the light guttered and his head went light and his hands began to shake, and then he stopped and rested and noted the mark, and never once let himself believe the war-trained hand could draw more than the child's well could give. The hand was a master's. The well was 11 years old. He would respect the well. Cores grew with use and with time and with nothing else, and the boy who burned his out trying to be a man before his body was ready would be a boy with no magic at all when the moment came that he needed all of it. Then he did the thing he had been circling since the cupboard, which was to go looking, deliberately and in daylight, for the piece of his enemy that lived behind his scar. He sat on the floor with his back to the boarded window and closed his eyes and went inward, down past the place where the light came from, to the cold sliver lodged in the dark behind the bone. It was still sleeping. He had felt its edges on the first morning and felt them again now, and this time he made himself stay with it long enough to learn its shape. It was a splinter of something that was not Harry, a coiled dormant cold, older and fouler than the cathedral's clean cold, a thing that hated by reflex even in its sleep. In the first life it had been a wound he carried without understanding, a back door into the Dark Lord's mind and the Dark Lord's into his, and in the end the only way anyone had found to be rid of it was for Harry to walk into the forest and let the green light kill the part of him that was Voldemort. He had done that the first time. He did not intend to do it again. There would be another way. He did not know it yet, and he made himself accept not knowing rather than reach for a comforting guess. But he had years, and he had the thing itself dormant and mapped and on his side of the wall where he could study it, and a problem you can see in daylight is not a problem that owns you. He withdrew from it gently, leaving it sleeping, and opened his eyes, and the boarded room was just a boarded room, and the splinter behind his scar was just a splinter for now. Dudley found him on the floor an hour later and stood in the doorway working up to something, a shove, a name, the small daily cruelty that had been the whole shape of their relationship for 10 years. Harry looked up at him, and Dudley, who could not have said why, found the words drying in his throat. There was nothing frightening in the boy on the floor. The black-haired cousin looked exactly as he always had, thin and unremarkable in clothes 4 sizes too big. But he was looking back at Dudley with an expression Dudley had no name for, the flat, patient attention of an adult who has decided a child is not worth being angry at, and it made the back of Dudley's neck prickle, and after a moment he muttered something and went away and did not come back. Harry let him go. Handling Dudley was not a thing that required cleverness or magic. It required only that Harry stop being afraid of him, and Harry had stopped being afraid of Dudley Dursley somewhere around the 3rd year of a war the boy would never hear about. He had no use for revenge on a frightened fat child. Revenge was a currency, and he was done spending it on people who did not matter, and Dudley did not matter, and the cleanest thing Harry could do to the whole house was simply to stop playing the part of the thing they could hurt. They could not hurt him. They had never been able to hurt him. He had only believed they could once when he was small and had no measure to set them against. He had every measure now. The house would not get to use him again in even the smallest way, because he had stepped out from under the only power it had ever held. He went back to his light and held it and grew the well a grain at a time and waited for the siege to break. The siege ran exactly as he remembered it, which pleased him, because a legible timeline was an asset and he had decided to spend nothing to disturb it. The letters came and Vernon burned them, and then more letters came, and Vernon nailed the mail slot shut, and Harry watched the man wage war on the Royal Mail with the grim energy of a small mind confronting a large terror, and he played his part. He performed the hunger to know what the letters said, let Vernon catch him trying to read an address, let himself be shoved back, let his face show the thwarted want of a curious child, because that was what the role required, and because giving Vernon a Harry to thwart kept Vernon busy with the wrong opponent. A man who is winning a war he doesn't know is happening does not begrudge his enemy a few satisfying victories in a war that doesn't matter. He found doing it that he had to manage the boy's body more carefully than he had expected. The mind was the man's, the reflexes were not. When Vernon's hand came down, the boy's body flinched, and the flinch was real, welded in by 1,000 childhood mornings, and Harry let it flinch because a child who did not flinch from Vernon Dursley would be a child Vernon noticed. But underneath the permitted flinch, the man watched the hand come down and felt nothing, not fear, not even the old banked anger, just the flat assessment of a small cruelty by someone who had been on the receiving end of enormous ones. The trick was to let the boy's body do its frightened dance while the man behind the eyes stayed perfectly still, and it was a trick he had used before in interrogations, wearing fear as camouflage over a stillness that was planning the room's destruction. He was good at it. He had not expected to need it against his own uncle, and there was something almost funny in that, and he allowed himself the private joke and nothing more. Petunia was harder, and he made himself understand why. Vernon was a wall, you went around a wall and did not think about it, but Petunia had known his mother. Petunia had grown up in a house with Lily Evans and had watched her sister get the letter Harry was now getting, and had been left behind, ordinary in the mundane world, and the whole sour architecture of the woman, the spying over fences, the obsessive normalcy, the hatred of anything strange, was the architecture of a wound. Harry had not understood that as a child. He understood it now with the comprehension of a man who had seen what wounds do to people when they fester for decades, and the understanding did not make him forgive her and did not make him hate her. It made her legible. She was a woman who had loved her sister and lost her to a world she couldn't follow into, and then been handed her dead sister's son to raise, a living daily reminder of everything she had been shut out of, and she had chosen to be cruel to the reminder rather than feel the grief, and that was a small, ugly human thing, and Harry had no time for it. But he watched her the morning the siege broke and Vernon herded them all to the car to flee the letters, and he caught her looking at him, one flat, unreadable look in the rearview mirror, gone the instant he met it, and he understood that she knew exactly what was happening, that she had always known, that she had spent his whole childhood watching the magic gather around him the way it had gathered around her sister, and dreading the day it would carry him off the way it had carried Lily off. Into the bright, strange world that had never once sent for Petunia Evans. He did not pity her. Pity was a currency, and he was done extending it on credit. But he marked her, she knows more than she says, and she will say less than she knows, and there is nothing here for me but the address on the letters, which I already have. And he looked out the car window at the gray Surrey road sliding past and let the boy's face go slack and frightened and small while the man behind it counted the days to Diagon Alley. The hotel by the motorway, then the howling night Vernon spent staring at the door with a shotgun across his knees, and then the rock in the sea. Harry remembered the rock. He had remembered it as misery, wet, freezing, hungry, a shack on a crag with the storm coming in and Dudley snoring on the bed or blanket. He experienced it now as something nearer to peace. The Dursleys huddled in their corner, the storm hammered the window, the sea boomed against the rock below, and Harry lay on the thin blanket on the floor and was, for the first time since the cupboard, genuinely alone with his own thoughts and a long unbroken stretch of dark in which to think them. He used the time. He laid out the years in his head as he had once laid out a campaign, not the whole war at once, which was a fool's way to plan, but the near ground first, the next defensible objective, and then the shape of the country beyond it. The near ground was Diagon Alley. Within it, 3 objectives in order of priority. First, Gringotts. He needed money, which he had in the trust vault under the alley, but he needed more than money. He needed the goblins. In his first life, he had treated Gringotts as a bank, a place you went to withdraw gold and were sneered at by tellers, and it had cost him, late in the war, when he had needed the goblins and found that he had spent 11 years giving them no reason to give him anything. The goblins did not love wizards. Wizards had spent 1,000 years lying to them and looting their work and writing laws that made the looting legal. But the goblins respected 3 things: gold, craft, and a debt honestly kept, and a wizard who understood that, and who came to them as something other than a creditor with his hand out, was a rare enough thing to be interesting. Harry intended to be interesting to the goblins. There were vaults he would want into in the years ahead that no wizard could open alone. Second, a wand. Ollivander would sell him the Holly and Phoenix wand, the brother to the Dark Lord's Yew, and Harry would let him, because the wand was an old friend and because changing it would be a flag planted for anyone watching. But he knew now what the wand was and what it would and would not do against its brother, and he would not, this time, build his whole defense on a connection he did not control. Third, knowledge. The book list would buy him the year's textbooks. His own gold would buy him everything else, the books the list did not mention, the ones a curious wealthy boy might plausibly buy, history and theory, and the gentle edge of the things a child was not supposed to want yet. He would have to be careful. A boy who bought the wrong books would be a boy who got noticed. But there was a great deal of knowledge that was perfectly respectable to want, and Harry had 20 years of knowing exactly which respectable-looking door led to the room he actually needed. He turned the plan over and found it sound, and then he made himself do the harder thing, which was to think about the people. He started deliberately with the ones who had hurt him, because those were the ones the animal in him wanted to think about, and a man should spend his anger in private planning rather than let it leak out in public moves. Dumbledore the architect 400 miles north, who would be watching the instruments and reading Mrs. Figg's letters and arranging the year ahead like a man setting out a chessboard. Harry would not move against Dumbledore, not for years. You do not attack the strongest piece on the board while you are still the weakest. You make the strongest piece believe you are exactly the pawn it set out, and you let it advance you square by square toward the promotion it intends, and you do not show it the queen you are until the moment you take its king. Dumbledore had played that game on Harry once. Harry had learned it from a master. He intended to play it back, then the others in their turn. Quirrell, who was a 400-mile north problem too, with the wraith riding his skull, that one would come due this very year, and Harry let himself look at it squarely and decided it could wait for Hogwarts. Pettigrew, who was a rat in a Weasley pocket and who was the lever that freed Sirius, and Sirius was Harry stopped there and made himself look at the stop. Sirius Black was alive. In a cell on a rock in a different sea, mad with grief and innocent of everything they put him in there for, but alive and freeable, and the closest thing to family Harry had ever been offered. In the first life, Sirius had died at the end of Harry's 5th year, through the veil in the Department of Mysteries, baited there by a lie Harry had been too young and too unguarded to see through. Harry had spent the war with that death sitting on his chest like a stone. And now Sirius was alive and gettable, and the rat that could free him was sleeping in a boy's pocket 200 miles away, and the whole thing could be done cleanly with one piece of evidence in the right ears to drop it in. That was the one. He noticed it and did not look away from it. Of all the bonds in his ruined first life, the ones he had chosen instead of been assigned, Sirius and Hagrid and a bare handful of others, were the only ones he was prepared to re-earn. Not extend on credit, re-earn. Sirius did not yet know Harry, would not know him for years. The man in Azkaban was a stranger to the boy on the rock. But Harry knew Sirius, knew the loyalty in him that had been wasted in a cell for 12 years, and Harry was going to spend some of his precious early moves getting him out, not because Sirius had earned it from this version of Harry, but because Harry had decided in the cold, clear arithmetic of his second life which debts he was willing to pay forward. Then the 2 he had been saving for last, because they were the 2 that the animal in him had the most to say about, and the man wanted them thought through cold. Ron Weasley, in 3 days' time on the platform and then the train, a freckled boy with a smudge on his nose and an empty sandwich box would look for somewhere to sit and find the compartment with the famous orphan in it, and a friendship would begin that had lasted through everything, almost to the very end. Almost. Harry made himself hold the whole arc of it at once, the good years and the bad, the boy who had walked into a giant's chess game and let himself be taken so Harry could go on, and the man who had stood in a gallery a lifetime later and looked at the wall. Both were true. Ron Weasley had been the best friend Harry ever had and had also, in the end, been one of the faces that would not look down, and the thing Harry understood now that he had not understood as a boy was that the two were not a contradiction. Ron loved fiercely and resented quietly, and the resentment had been there from the first year, the second son ache of always standing next to someone brighter, and it had been a small thing for a long time, and then the war had fed it, and the peace had let it bloom. Harry was not going to hand this version of Ron the seat in the compartment and the easy decade of trust that grew the resentment in the dark where Harry couldn't see it. He would be courteous, he would not be cruel, but he would not be owed, and he would not let a boy attach himself to Harry's fame and call it friendship and nurse a grievance underneath it for 10 years. If Ron Weasley wanted Harry's trust this time, he would earn it in the open like everyone else, and Harry would watch the resentment in him the way you watch a crack in a wall you have decided not to lean on. And the girl, he let himself think her name on the rock in the dark, because a man who cannot make himself look at the thing that hurt him most is a man who will be moved by it without knowing. Hermione Granger. In a few weeks, a bossy, frightened, brilliant girl with too much hair and too many books would correct his Latin on a train and be insufferable about it. And within months she would walk into a bathroom to face a mountain troll because the boys had hurt her feelings, and somewhere in there she would become the cleverest, most loyal friend a person could ask for. And 20 years after that she would sit down at a desk and design, with that same cleverness and that same terrible thoroughness, the right that peeled the magic off him root and filament so that the green light would take. She had done it because she loved the world more than she loved him. She had done it cleanly, mercifully, correctly, because if it had to be done she would not let it be done badly, and that Harry understood was the most Hermione thing she had ever done, and it was why it had been her handwriting on the parchment, and it was why of all of them she was the one he could not let himself hate and could not let himself trust. Because here was the trap the cathedral had not warned him about. She was not yet that woman. The girl on the train had never weighed him against a kingdom. She had only ever, in the whole length of his first life, chosen him over rules, over fear, over her own safety again and again, until the very last calculation when the kingdom won. And the temptation, the soft, dangerous temptation, was to look at the 11-year-old and forgive her for the thing the 40-year-old had not yet done and might now never do. Harry set the temptation down where he could see it. He would not forgive her in advance, but he would not punish her in advance either, because punishing a child for a grown woman's choice was the act of a man who had let his grief make his decisions, and Harry's grief had died in the courtyard, and he was not going to resurrect it to run his life. He would test her. He would give her chances to be the friend and chances to be the calculator, and he would watch which she chose, in small things first and larger ones later, and he would extend exactly as much of himself as she proved she could be trusted to hold. No more, provisional, on terms, forever if she earned it, not 1 inch on credit if she didn't. It was, he reflected, the hardest item on the whole list, and he was a little surprised to find that it was. He had thought the hardest thing would be Dumbledore, or the Wraith, or the long cold patience of pretending to be a pawn, but those were chess. The girl was something else. The girl was the proof that his second life was not going to be as clean as the arithmetic pretended, that some of the pieces on the board were people he had loved, and that loving them and not trusting them at the same time was a discipline he was going to have to learn the way he had learned everything else, under fire, without a teacher, getting it wrong before he got it right. He let the warmth of that sit in him for exactly as long as it was useful, and then he set it down because the storm was loudest now, and the hour was very late, and somewhere out across the black water, a heavy shape was coming toward the rock that Harry had carried dead for 20 years. Hagrid came through the door at midnight with the storm at his back and a pink umbrella in his fist, and Harry, lying on the floor in the dark, felt his throat close in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He had told himself he was ready for this. He had laid the plan, he had set the role, he had reminded himself that the giant filling the doorway did not know him, and that the death at the causeway had not happened and would not happen if Harry did his work. He had told himself all of it on the long days of the siege, and none of it survived the actual sight of Rubeus Hagrid alive, soaked to the bone, enormous and ridiculous, and so completely, uncomplicatedly kind that the whole architecture of Harry's grief came down in a single breath. The last time he had seen this man, Hagrid had been a broken shape in a flooded breach with a spear snapped in his hands, and Harry had been 40 yards away and unable to close the distance, and he had screamed something he never afterward remembered, and the line had held because Hagrid bought it with his life. And here he was, dripping on the floor of a shack, holding out a squashed birthday cake in a battered box and saying in that great rumbling voice, "Last time I saw you, you was only a baby." Harry sat up on the blanket, and for one unguarded second he was not the sable and not the man behind the boy's eyes and not 3 moves ahead of anyone. He was just a person looking at someone he had watched die who was not dead. "Hello," he said. His voice came out rough. He covered it. He let the roughness read as a boy's fear of the giant, a boy's confusion at the storm and the stranger, and Hagrid, who had a heart the size of his hands and no suspicion in him anywhere, took it for exactly that and softened all over and said, "Blimey, didn't mean ter frighten ye," and sat down on the sofa, which groaned, and began the long, warm, clumsy business of telling a boy he was a wizard. Harry played it as written. He had to. Any deviation here, any sign that the boy on the rock already knew what a wizard was, already knew the word Hogwarts, already knew the name Voldemort and did not flinch from it, would be a thread for someone cleverer than Hagrid to pull, and the someone clever was reading the reports. So Harry performed the wonder. He let his eyes go wide at the cake and wider at the umbrella that lit the fire, and he asked the questions a boy would ask, and he let Hagrid tell him the gentle lie about his parents dying in a car crash being a lie, and watched the kind face fold in on itself with the old anger when Vernon called Lily and James what he called them. But he banked everything. Under the performance, the man was working, and the man had a list of things he needed from Hagrid that Hagrid would never know he had given, and Harry drew them out one at a time, in the natural shape of a curious boy's questions, so that not one of them stood out. He asked about Hogwarts and learned nothing new but confirmed the timeline. He asked about the war sideways, as a frightened child asks about the monster under the bed, and let Hagrid stumble through the name and the fear of it and the awful careful way grown wizards talked about the man who had killed his parents. And Harry watched the giant's hands shake on the word and understood, freshly, the size of the terror the wizarding world still carried, the terror that would make it follow anyone who could end it, and then fear that anyone afterward. He asked about Dumbledore, and Hagrid lit up like a lamp and called him the greatest man who ever lived and the only one you know who ever feared, and Harry nodded and made his eyes shine and thought, behind them, yes, the greatest man who ever lived, and he is reading a squib's letters about me right now, and he is the patientest enemy I will ever have. And he asked last in the most innocent voice he owned, with the cake half-eaten in his lap and the storm easing outside, "Hagrid, how do people get to Gringotts? Is it safe, to leave money there, I mean, forever?" And Hagrid laughed his great booming laugh and said the only safe place in the world was Gringotts, 'cept maybe Hogwarts, and the goblins ran it, and ye'd be mad ter try and rob it, and that was that, and Harry tucked away the small thing he had actually been fishing for, that Hagrid himself was being sent to Gringotts on Dumbledore's business this very trip, to collect something from a vault, a thing wrapped in brown paper that a boy was not supposed to ask about. Because the something in the vault was the Philosopher's Stone, and the trip to fetch it was the first thread of the first betrayer's plot, and it was beginning, right here in front of him, in the warm rumble of a kind man who had no idea he was carrying the opening move of a war. Harry finished his cake. He let Hagrid tuck him under a borrowed coat by the fire. He listened to the giant fall asleep, and the storm fall quiet, and the sea keep booming far below, and he lay awake in the warm dark on the rock and held two things at once, which a man learns to do or breaks. The first was the warmth. Hagrid was alive. Of all the gifts the cathedral had handed back, that was the one Harry had not let himself ask for, and here it was, snoring on a sofa 6 feet away, and Harry was going to keep it alive this time if it cost him everything else, and that was not strategy, that was the one purely selfish promise he allowed himself in the whole cold architecture of his plan. The second was the cold, the cathedral's marker at the base of him, steady, patient, lent. And under the cold the plan unfurling toward the morning and the alley and the long game beyond it. He had proof of the world and proof of his power, and now proof that the things he loved had been given back to him along with the things he hated. He had a board with every piece on it. He had a list of who would reach for him and when. And he had, lying awake on a rock in the sea with a sleeping giant for company, made the last decision of the siege, the one all the others had been circling. He was going to do everything differently, not louder, not faster where faster meant careless, but differently in the one way that mattered. This time no one got his trust for free. This time every loyalty he extended would be a loyalty he chose, eyes open, knowing exactly what the person across from him was capable of becoming because he had already seen what they became. Hagrid had earned it without knowing. Sirius would earn it from a cell. The rest of them, Dumbledore, Ron, the girl whose handwriting he would not think about tonight, the whole bright, grateful world that had carried him on its shoulders and then chained him to a ring, the rest of them would get from Harry Potter exactly what they gave, measured to the gram on terms he set and they did not know existed. The boy who had walked through this doorway the first time had let the world on the other side of it decide what he was. The man lying awake on the rock had already decided. He was 11 years old and he had been to the bottom of the world and come back, and tomorrow he was going to walk into Diagon Alley and begin, very quietly, to take it apart and rebuild it into something that could never again do to him what it had done. Outside, the storm blew itself out. The first gray of morning touched the window. Hagrid snored, and Harry Potter closed his eyes and rested because the game began at dawn and a man does not start a long game tired. He did not dream. He had nothing left to dream about. He had a war to win, and this time he already knew the ending he was going to refuse. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The cold game begins. The leaky cauldron smelled of spilled ale and pipe smoke and the particular damp of old timber, and the moment Harry stepped through the door behind Hagrid, the whole room turned to look at him. He had forgotten this part. Not the fact of it, he remembered being mobbed, the handshakes, the weeping woman, the stammering man in the turban, but the texture, the animal pressure of a crowded room all wanting a piece of you at once. As a boy it had frightened him. He had shrunk from it, overwhelmed. A child suddenly told he was famous for a thing he could not remember surviving. He did not shrink now. He let his face do the shrinking, the wide eyes, the half-step closer to Hagrid's enormous reassuring bulk, while behind it the man took the room apart in a single sweep and catalogued every face in it, because a man who has been hunted learns to read a crowd as other people read a sentence. Tom the barman, toothless and beaming. Doris Crockford, who would shake his hand 4 times. A knot of witches by the fire who would whisper for a week that they had seen the boy who lived by a butter beer. And there, rising from a corner table with his hand already extended and his pale face arranged into a nervous, ingratiating smile, the turban wound high and absurd around his head, Quirinus Quirrell. Harry took the offered hand. He had decided on the rock exactly how to play this, and he played it now without a flicker. He let his small hand be swallowed in the trembling, clammy grip, and he looked up into the stammering man's watery eyes, and he felt under the bone, behind the scar, the sliver of soul that lived in him stir, just slightly, the way a sleeping dog's ear twitches at a sound it half knows. Because the thing on the back of Quirrell's head under the turban, soaking through the stink of garlic the man wore to mask it, was the other half of what Harry carried, the Wraith. The Dark Lord reduced to a parasite, riding a weak man's skull, 400 miles from the forest where he drank unicorn blood and waited for the stone that would give him a body. The first time Harry's scar had only prickled and he had thought nothing of it. This time he knew the prickle for what it was, recognition, the splinter in his head leaning toward the larger ruin of itself, and he held perfectly still inside, clamped down hard on the cold sliver so it would not lean back, so the thing in the turban would feel nothing but the ordinary scart whinge it expected from the boy it had marked. "P.P. Potter," Quirrell stammered, "see can't tell you how pleased I am to meet you." "You're a teacher," Harry said, pitching his voice young and bright. Hagrid said, "What do you teach?" "Defense against the dark arts." A laugh that was meant to be self-deprecating and came out wet. "And not that you need it, P. Potter." "Everyone needs it," Harry said, and let the boy's earnestness carry it, and watched the watery eyes flick just once with something that was not Quirrell at all, something colder and older looking out through a borrowed face, measuring the child in front of it and finding, to its faint puzzlement, nothing it could name. Then Hagrid's hand came down on Harry's shoulder, gentle as a falling beam, and steered him toward the back, and the moment closed. It had cost Harry nothing. It had told him everything he needed. The Wraith was here, on schedule, weak and watching, and it had looked at Harry and seen a boy. Good, let it keep seeing a boy for as long as Harry needed it to. He would deal with the turban in its proper season. For now he had marked it, and a thing marked is a thing half beaten, and he let Hagrid lead him out into the little walled courtyard where the bricks waited to fold themselves open. Diagon Alley unrolled in front of him exactly as it had 20 years ago, and the sameness of it was a blow he had not braced for. He had braced for the people. He had not braced for the place, for the crooked cobbled street climbing away under its lopsided shop fronts, the cauldrons stacked outside the apothecary, the gold letters of Gringotts catching the morning at the far end, the whole bright crowded living artery of the world he had watched bleed out over 7 years of war. In his first life's last year, Diagon Alley had been half-shuttered, its windows boarded, Dementors drifting at the mouth of Nocturne, and the Ministry's wanted posters peeling on every wall. He had not seen it whole and unafraid since he was a boy. And here it was, whole, the children dragging their parents toward the broomstick window, the owls hooting in their cages, an old wizard arguing cheerfully with a fruit bat seller, and not one of them knew what was coming, and Harry stood at the mouth of the street and let the one permitted breath of grief move through him and out. One beat, he gave it one beat. Then he set it down, because grief was a passenger and he was driving and there was work. "Gringotts furs," Hagrid rumbled, mopping his face with a tablecloth-sized handkerchief, still green about the gills from the trip through London. "Get your money. And I got a bit o' Hogwarts business ter see to as well, fur Dumbledore." "Business?" Harry asked, all bright curiosity. "Can say." Hagrid tapped the side of his nose, then immediately looked stricken at having drawn attention to it. "Top secret, that is, Hogwarts business." "All right," Harry said easy and let it drop, and did not let his face show that he knew the brown paper package waiting in Vault 713 was the Philosopher's Stone, the Flamel's work, the thing the Wraith in the turban had come to England to steal. He knew the whole shape of it. He knew that in an hour Hagrid would carry that package up into the daylight, and that within days it would be locked behind a trapdoor on the third-floor corridor under a set of protections that a determined first year had once walked through in a single night. He knew the stone was both bait and prize, that Dumbledore had set it at Hogwarts precisely to draw the Wraith into the open, that the whole of Harry's first year had been a slow trap with a child for the trigger. He intended to change the design of that trap. But not today. Today he was a boy getting his money. They went up the white stone steps, past the bronze doors and the silver ones with their engraved warning to thieves, and into the vast marble hall where 100 goblins sat at 100 high desks, weighing coins, measuring gems, scratching in ledgers with long-nibbed quills. The first time Harry had found them frightening, the long fingers, the clever, cruel faces, the contemptuous way they looked at wizards. He understood them better now. Contempt is what you give people who have spent 1,000 years robbing you and calling it law. Hagrid lumbered up to the nearest free desk and announced, far too loudly, that Mr. Harry Potter would like to make a withdrawal, and produced the little gold key, and the goblin took it and examined it and said it seemed to be in order. And then Hagrid produced, with the furtive triumph of a man who cannot keep a secret to save his life, a letter from Dumbledore about the you-know-what in Vault 713, and the goblin's eyebrows climbed and the matter was arranged. Harry let all of it happen, but before they were led off to the carts, he did the one thing he had come to Gringotts to do, and he did it small enough that Hagrid, fussing with his coat, never noticed. He looked up at the goblin Griffook, the brass plate said the very one, and he spoke low in the formal register he had learned across years of dealing with the goblin nation in the war, the cadence of the old treaties that wizards had long stopped bothering to use. "Master Goblin," he said, "I'm grateful for the courtesy of the house. When I'm older I'll have estate business to put in order, and I'd rather it was done properly, by people who understand value. May I ask for the manager of the Potter accounts by name so I know whom to write to?" The goblin went still. It was not a long stillness, but Harry caught it, the flick of black eyes refocusing, the reassessment of the small wizard who had spoken to a goblin as though a goblin were a person, in the language of obligation rather than the language of demand. Wizard children did not do this. Wizard adults did not do this. Griffook's clever face did not soften exactly, but something behind it sharpened with interest. "The Potter accounts are managed by Ragnar's office," the goblin said after a moment. "You would write to the director of hereditary accounts, Mr. Potter." A pause, and then, in a tone that was almost grudging, "It is not common for your kind to ask." "My kind don't usually have the sense," Harry said mildly, and the goblin's mouth twitched at one corner, not a smile. Goblins did not give wizards smiles, but the nearest thing to it that the marble hall had seen all morning. "Thank you, Master Griffook, I'll remember the courtesy." It was a small seed. He knew it was small. But goblins remembered everything, every slight, every debt, every wizard who had ever lied to them across a counter. And they remembered the rare wizard who treated the ledger as a thing of honor and not just a thing of gold. And Harry was planting, 11 years early, the first root of a relationship that he would need fully grown long before the war he intended to prevent could start. Late in his first life, he had earned the goblin's help at terrible cost, and far too late. This time he would have it banked with interest before anyone else at the table knew the table existed. The cart came rattling out of the dark on its little iron rails, and Griffook handed them in, and then the plunge down and down through the lantern-lit tunnels, past the underground lake, past the deep cold air that came up off the lower vaults like breath out of a grave. Hagrid clung to the side with both fists and his eyes shut, moaning faintly. Harry, who had ridden these tunnels in the worst hour of the war with a dragon and a stolen cup and the whole bank screaming behind him, found the ride almost restful, and he used the descent to do what he had ridden down here to do. He watched the goblin. He watched Griffook's hands on the brake, the easy, contemptuous competence of them, and he watched the ruined door slide past, the ward script glowing faint on the deeper vaults, the old defensive magic that wizards had paid the goblins to lay and then pretended they had not needed. There were things Harry would want in the years ahead from behind doors like these. Not the Potter gold, that was nothing, that was pocket money. There was a cup in the Lestrange vault, far down in the oldest tier, a small golden Hufflepuff cup that was not a cup at all but a piece of a soul, one of the anchors that had kept the Dark Lord stitched to the world through all the years of the First War's aftermath. Harry knew where every one of those anchors was. He knew the cup sat in the dark a few hundred feet from where he rode now, guarded by ward and dragon and the Lestrange's paranoia, and that getting it out the first time had cost him a friendship with the Goblin Nation and very nearly his life. This time he had 11 years and a relationship he was building from the first handshake. This time he would not steal the cup. He would arrange somehow, by some patient legal and illegal means he had not yet fully designed, to have it brought up into the light with goblin help and goblin consent, and the difference between those two methods was the difference between the war he had lived and the war he meant to prevent. He did not have the whole plan yet. He had the shape of it, and the shape was enough to be going on with, and he let the cart carry him down past the cup's vault without so much as turning his head, because a boy who looked too long at the deep tier was a boy a goblin remembered for the wrong reasons. He filled the bag Hagrid gave him in the Potter vault, the gold and silver and bronze that the first time had stunned him, and now read simply as capital. And then quietly, while Hagrid was being sick over the side of the cart at the thought of the return journey, He filled a second, smaller pouch he had asked Griffook for at the desk, because the things Harry meant to buy today were not on any Hogwarts list, and he did not intend to count them out in front of anyone. In Vault 713, the deep one, where Griffook ran a long finger down the door and it simply melted away, and inside, on the cold stone floor, a single grubby little brown paper package no bigger than a fist. Hagrid snatched it up and stuffed it deep inside his coat and looked enormously relieved. Harry looked at it for exactly 1 second, the stone, the trigger, the first move of the war that had ended with him chained to a ring, and then looked away, bored, a boy who had already lost interest, and asked Hagrid whether they could get ice cream after. Back in the daylight, Hagrid needed to sit down, badly, and a strong drink worse, and he gave Harry the list and a fistful of instructions and a meeting time, and lumbered off toward the leaky cauldron with one hand pressed to his coat, and for the first time since the rock Harry was alone in the open world. He used it. He did not go to the shops in the order a child would. He went in the order a quartermaster would, the order that put the irreplaceable things first and the trivial ones last, and he moved through the alley at the unhurried pace of a boy with all day, which was the pace least likely to draw a watcher's eye. The trunk first, not the cheap one the list implied, but a good one, from the luggage maker 3 doors up from the apothecary, and not the surface he asked the man for either. He asked in a boy's idle way whether trunks ever came with extra room inside, the way he'd heard some did, and the luggage maker, scenting a sale, showed him the better models. The 2-compartment, the 4, the 7 lock with a compartment that opened to a different key and was, the man said with a wink, exactly as deep as a body cared to make it. Harry bought the 7 lock. He paid from the quiet pouch. He told the man to have it sent to the leaky cauldron under the name Potter and thought no more about it, except to note that a boy who owned a compartment no one else had the key to was a boy with somewhere to keep the books he was about to buy. Then the apothecary, because the list called for a basic potions kit, and Harry wanted rather more than a basic kit. The shop was dim and pungent, barrels of slime and bins of dried roots and silver horns and great glass jars of things suspended in fluid, and the smell of it, sulfur and rot and a sweetness underneath, was a smell Harry associated with 2 things, Snape's dungeon and the long nights in the war when he had brewed his own healing draughts because there had been no one left to brew them for him. He bought the kit on the list. Then he bought, in the unhurried way of a curious wealthy child, a handful of additions that no one could object to a future student wanting: extra dittany which closed wounds, a stock of standard ingredients for the pain and sleep and clarity potions a clever boy might want to practice, a small brass scale of better quality than the kits, all of it legal, all of it dull. All of it the quiet beginning of a stockpile, because Harry had learned in the worst year of the war that the side with the medicine outlasts the side with the courage, and he did not intend this time to be caught without. He paid from the quiet pouch and had it sent to the trunk, and he stepped back out into the alley and stood for a moment at the mouth of a narrow side turning. He remembered Knockturn Alley, sloping away into shadow, its shop fronts crowded with things that watched you back. He did not go down it. A boy who went down Knockturn with no adult was a boy who got noticed or robbed or worse, and there was nothing down there he needed yet. But he marked it, the way he had marked the turban and the cup's vault resources for later, when I am older and harder to follow, and turned away, and went to buy his books. Flourish and Blots was a cathedral of paper, shelves climbing to the ceiling, ladders on rails, the smell of binding glue and old leather that was, to Harry, the single most comforting smell in either of his lives. He bought the year's set first, the standard book of spells, the history, the herbology, all of it stacked and ordinary. Then he wandered, a curious wealthy boy with money to spend, and he let the wandering carry him to exactly the shelves he wanted. He was careful. A boy who bought a book on the dark arts would be a boy a shopkeeper remembered and mentioned, and the wrong ear would hear of it. So he bought nothing that wasn't perfectly respectable to want, but a great deal was respectable to want if you knew how to look. A thick history of the Wisengamot and its great trials, because a man who meant to never again be tried had better understand the machinery. A treatise on magical theory aimed at clever older students, dense and dry and entirely legal. A surprisingly frank text on the magical mind, its defenses and its invasions, shelved under mental discipline and sold to him without a blink, because occlumency was a respectable art and only its applications were not. A history of old wizarding families and their entailments, for the inheritance work he had told Griffook about and now intended to actually do. And on a low shelf near the door, a battered second-hand book of children's tales, the tales of Beetle the Bard, which he bought last and almost as an afterthought, and which was the only purchase that was not, in fact, an afterthought at all, because the last tale in it was the tale of the 3 brothers, and the 3 brothers were the Hallows, and the Hallows were the deepest of all the cards Harry held, and the one he meant to understand from the ground up this time instead of stumbling into. He paid. He had the lot sent to the trunk. The shopkeeper thought him a charming, bookish, slightly odd child, which was precisely the impression Harry had set out to leave, He had one more thing to do before robes, and it was not a purchase. He found a quiet bench in the sun outside the stationer's with a clear sightline up and down the street, and he sat, an ordinary boy resting his feet, and he spent 10 minutes doing the most important work of the day, which was thinking. The stone. That was the year's hinge, and he turned it over now while he had the quiet. In the first life, the protections around the stone had been a gauntlet built by the staff, Fluffy, the devil's snare, the keys, the chest, the troll, Snape's potion riddle, and at the end the mirror of Arist, which gave the stone only to one who wanted to find it and not to use it. The whole thing had been, Harry understood now, less a fortress than a stage. Dumbledore had wanted the Wraith to try for the stone, had wanted the confrontation, had perhaps even wanted Harry to be the one who met it, to test the boy and the bond between them. A trap with a child for the trigger. It had nearly killed him. He was not going to be that trigger this time. But he was also not going to simply avoid the third-floor corridor, because the Wraith left unmet did not go away. It went and tried again somewhere worse, and a Voldemort who got the stone got a body, and a Voldemort with a body was the seed of every grave Harry had ever dug. No. The stone had to be denied, and the Wraith had to be met, and the meeting had to happen on Harry's terms and not Dumbledore's, in a place and an hour Harry chose, with the outcome decided before either of his enemies knew the game had started. He did not have the full design yet. He had the constraints, and the constraints were enough. Deny the stone, break the vessel, do it without showing the school that the smallest first year was anything other than small. The rest he would build at Hogwarts, with the room he knew and the foreknowledge he carried. He let the plan settle into the cold place where he kept such things, and he rose from the bench, an ordinary boy with rested feet, and went to buy his robes. The bell over Madame Malkin's door chimed, and there he was, pale, pointed, perfectly turned out, standing on the second stool with his chin up while a witch pinned his hem. Draco Malfoy, 11 years old, bored and imperious and entirely unaware that he was about to meet the person who would, in another life, hate him for a decade and pity him at the end of it. Harry climbed onto the stool beside him and let Madame Malkin's assistant start pinning, and waited. He did not have to wait long. "Hello," said the boy. "Hogwarts too?" "Yes," said Harry. "My father's next door buying my books and mother's up the street looking at wands." A practiced drawl inherited whole from a man Harry had watched grovel and scheme and finally die badly. "Then I'm going to drag them off to look at racing brooms. I don't see why first years can't have their own. I think I'll bully father into getting me one and smuggle it in somehow." The first time this speech had set Harry's teeth on edge, the casual entitlement, the assumption that the world was a thing arranged for Malfoys. He had taken an instant dislike, and the dislike had hardened over years into something that cost them both. He felt none of the heat now. He looked at the boy on the stool and saw, with the clarity of a man who had watched the whole arc, a frightened child performing a confidence he did not feel, raised by a cold and dangerous man to be a smaller copy of him, standing, though neither of them knew it. About 3 years from the morning, a Dark Lord would move into his house and begin using his family as furniture. Harry was not going to be Draco Malfoy's friend. The boy was poison in this season of his life, all second-hand prejudice and brittle pride, and befriending him would cost more than it bought. But he was not going to make Draco his enemy either, because he had learned, the long expensive way, that an enemy made at 11 is an enemy you carry for a decade, and Harry had no intention of carrying a single ounce of weight he could set down. So when Draco turned the drawl on him, "Have you got your own broom?" Harry simply said no, pleasant and flat, and offered nothing for the boy to push against. "Play Quidditch at all?" "Not yet. I do. Father says it'd be a crime if I'm not picked to play for my house, and I must say I agree." Draco waited for the awe. Harry gave him a polite nod, the nod of a boy who has heard the information and stored nothing under it. It visibly unsettled the Malfoy heir, who was used to one of two reactions, admiration or resentment, and had no script for mild indifference. "Know what house you'll be in yet?" Draco tried. "No," Harry said. "Do you?" "Well, no one really knows until they get there, do they? But I know I'll be in Slytherin. All our family have been. Imagine being in Hufflepuff. I think I'd leave, wouldn't you?" And then the line Harry remembered, the line that had drawn the battle the first time. "I say, look at that man." It was Hagrid, beaming and waving through the window, 2 enormous ice creams in his fists. "That's Hagrid," Harry said before Draco could start. "He works at Hogwarts. He's a friend of mine." "Oh," said Draco in the tone of a boy stepping in something. "I've heard of him. He's a sort of servant, isn't he?" "He's the keeper of keys and grounds," Harry said, still pleasant, still flat, "and he's a friend of mine." And he held the pale boy's eyes for one unhurried second, not a glare, nothing a witch with a mouthful of pins would notice, just the steady level look of someone entirely unimpressed and entirely unafraid. And Draco Malfoy, who had spent his whole short life surrounded by people who flinched or fawned, met that look and found he had nothing to say to it. "You're done, dear," said Madame Malkin to Harry, and he stepped off the stool and paid and left the Malfoy heir standing on his pedestal with his fitting unfinished, and an expression on his face that he would spend the rest of the day failing to account for. He had not made a friend. He had not made an enemy. He had made an impression of a boy who could not be moved, which was worth more than either, and he ate his ice cream on the step outside with Hagrid, and let the giant tell him about Hogwarts houses, and watched the alley go by, and waited for the last and oldest errand of the day. He left the wand for last, the way you leave the most important card for last, and when Hagrid steered him toward the narrow shabby shop with the peeling gold letters, Ollivanders, makers of fine wands since 382 BC, Harry felt the cold at the base of him shift, just slightly, the way it did near things that touched the deep machinery of the world. The shop was as he remembered, a single spindly chair, a dust of years, the thousands of narrow boxes stacked to the ceiling in the dimness, and the particular hush of a place where serious things were measured. And Ollivander himself, pale and wide-eyed, materializing out of the shelves with that unnerving softness, his silver eyes catching the light like a cat's. "Ah," he breathed, "yes, I wondered when I'd be seeing you, Mr. Potter." The first time the old man's recitation had raised the hairs on Harry's neck, the unsettling memory for every wand he'd ever sold, the long account of Harry's parents' wands, the slow circling toward the thing in the dark. This time Harry sat in the spindly chair and watched the performance with the appreciation of one craftsman for another, because Garrick Ollivander was, in his way, one of the most dangerous men in Britain, a man who really saw, more clearly than almost anyone alive, and who could not be lied to about the things he cared about. Harry would have to be careful here. Ollivander read wands, and wands read the people who held them, and Harry was wearing a child's body around a thing that had been to the bottom of the world and back, and he did not entirely know what a wand would make of that. The tape measured, danced, and measured. Ollivander pulled boxes. The first wand, the second, snatched away before Harry had half raised it. He let the process run, giving nothing, a boy waiting patiently to be matched. And Ollivander grew, as he always did, more delighted and more intent, muttering, peering, until at last he went very still and went to a particular shelf and came back with a particular box and said softly, "I wonder," and lifted out the wand of holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, supple, that Harry had carried through everything until the morning they snapped it on the steps of the Wisengamot. He took it. It knew him. He had braced for the warmth, the rush of red and gold sparks, the click of a thing fitting its hand, and it came, all of it, the wand recognizing the magic that had grown up wielding it. But there was more this time, a thing Harry felt, and Ollivander, watching with those silver eyes, felt too. A depth in the joining that should not have been there, a resonance like a struck bell heard from very far down, as though the wand were greeting not a boy it had never met, but an old master returned. For one bad instant Harry felt the recognition threaten to show on his face, and he clamped down hard behind the wall he had been rebuilding since the cupboard, and let only a child's delighted surprise reach his eyes. Ollivander's gaze sharpened anyway. "Curious," the old man murmured. "Curious, curious." "What's curious?" Harry asked, exactly as he had the first time. And Ollivander told him the brother wand, the yew and phoenix feather, the single bird that had given 2 feathers, one to this wand and one to the wand that gave Harry his scar. "It is very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar." He leaned close, the silver eyes very bright. "Yes, 13.5 inches. You, curious indeed how these things happen. The wand chooses the wizard, remember. I think we must expect great things from you, Mr. Potter. After all, he who must not be named did great things, terrible, yes, but great." This was the part Harry had come for. The first time he had only shivered. This time he looked up at the old wand-maker, at the one person in the alley with the eyes to see something wrong in him, and he gave Ollivander, very deliberately, a single true thing wrapped in a child's words, because a craftsman like this one could not be deflected by a lie but could sometimes be satisfied by a truth he did not understand. "I don't want to do great things," Harry said quietly. "Great things got my parents killed." It landed. Ollivander blinked, and the sharpness in his face shifted into something gentler and more puzzled, and Harry watched the old man revise his reed, from strange power in this child toward strange grief in this child, which was a wrong conclusion built honestly on a true premise, and which would satisfy the silver eyes far better than any deflection could have. Ollivander wrapped the wand in brown paper and took his 7 galleons and let Harry go with the look of a man who had glimpsed something he could not name and decided for once not to chase it. He almost let it go. At the door, his hand on the latch, Harry heard the old man say softly behind him, "Mr. Potter, the wand that chose you today is a wand for a soldier, you know. Holly does not come to the comfortable. It comes to those who will have to fight and would rather not." A pause. "I hope for your sake that it has misjudged you." "So do I," Harry said without turning, and went out into the gold of the afternoon, and did not let the old man see his face, because the holly wand had not misjudged him in either life, and they both, in their different ways, knew it. He stepped back out into the alley with the wand under his arm and the cold quiet at the base of him, and the whole long board of the future spread out clean in his mind. He had what he had come for, and more than the list. He had a wand that knew him and a trunk no one else could open, and a shelf of books that were exactly as innocent as they looked, and not one bit more. He had a stockpile begun in the apothecary, and a side turning marked for later, and a vault of soul anchor noted in the dark. He had planted a root with the goblins that would be a tree before anyone noticed it growing. He had stood a foot from the wraith and given it nothing, and a foot from the wandmaker and given him a grief instead of a secret, and he had met the Malfoy heir and made himself a thing the boy could not push. He had walked the whole length of the world he meant to save and let himself grieve it for exactly 3 beats and no more. Hagrid found him there, ice cream long gone, the afternoon going gold over the crooked rooftops, and asked if he'd got everything, and Harry said yes, he thought he had. "Ye all rig, Harry?" Hagrid peered down at him, suddenly anxious, reading some quietness in the boy that he could not place. "Ye have gone all quiet." "I'm fine," Harry said, and looked up at the giant who was alive, who would stay alive this time, and let one true thing show in his face because Hagrid had earned it. "It's just a lot, the whole world being bigger than I thought." Hagrid's eyes went bright and wet, and he put one vast hand on Harry's shoulder, almost the whole of his back, and said something thick about it being a lot for anyone, and a great wizard's son besides, and Harry let himself be steered toward the train back to London, a small black-haired boy beside an enormous gentle man, the most ordinary sight in the alley. Behind them, in the dim of the leaky cauldron, a stammering man in a turban sat alone at a corner table and stared at nothing, and turned a goblet slowly in his trembling hands, and felt, though he could not have said why, though the thing on the back of his skull could not have said why either, that the famous, harmless, unremarkable child he had shaken hands with that morning had left him with an itch he could not scratch, a sense of having been weighed by something he had mistaken for a boy. He drank his wine and told himself it was nerves. The thing on his skull did not tell itself anything. It only remembered the boy's eyes and the way the Scarlink had moved, and it began, very faintly, in the patient way of a thing with nothing but time, to wonder. Far to the north, in a circular office, an old man turned over a thin report from a woman in little winging. The boy is quiet, polite, gives no trouble, knows nothing, and was satisfied, and set it aside, and went back to the larger game of the year ahead, the stone and the trap in the defense post he had so carefully left open, never once suspecting that the smallest piece on his board had begun, very quietly, to move itself. And on the train, watching the alley fall away behind the London rooftops, Harry Potter ate the rock cake Hagrid pressed on him, and let the cold settle, and counted, with the patient pleasure of a man who has finally got his hands back on the board, the days until the 1st of September. The cold game had begun. No one but Harry knew the first move had been played. That was exactly how he wanted it. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Trust no loyalty. Harry reached the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 at 10:30 on the 1st of September, a full hour early, because a man who controls the ground arrives before the people he means to read. He had got himself to King's Cross alone. Vernon had dumped him at the station with a sneer and a screech of tires, glad to be rid of him, and Harry had not minded, because a boy delivered and abandoned was a boy with an hour of unwatched time and a trolley to push, and he had used it. He found a quiet stretch of platform 9, leaned against a pillar with his trunk in the empty owl cage he'd bought for cover, and watched the ordinary morning crowd flow past, commuters, tourists, a man arguing with a vending machine, and let himself settle into the role he would wear for the next 7 years. It was a strange role, and he made himself feel the strangeness once cleanly, so it would not surprise him later. He was about to walk back into the building where the whole catastrophe of his first life had been seated, where he had made the friends who became the people in the gallery, learned the loyalty that would be turned against him, been shaped, lesson by lesson, into the weapon they would one day decide to destroy. Hogwarts had been the best thing that ever happened to the boy he had been. It had also been the forge. And Harry was going to walk back into the forge with his eyes open this time, and let it shape a different blade, one with its own hand on its own hilt. The Weasleys came at 11:15, exactly on schedule, a tide of red hair and trunks, and a plump, kind, harried woman herding them, her voice carrying clear across the concourse. Packed with muggles, of course. Harry watched them come. He felt the old pull. God, he felt it. The warmth of that family had been the first warmth anyone had ever offered him. Molly's cooking and Arthur's wonder and the whole loud, loving chaos of the burrow that had been more a home to him than anywhere, and he stood at his pillar and let the pull move through him and did not move toward it. Because the first time he had gone to Molly Weasley, lost and friendless, and asked how to get onto the platform, and she had taken him under her wing, and that had been the beginning. The beginning of Ron, the beginning of the seat on the train, the easy decade, the brother who became the man at the gallery wall. None of it had been a lie, that was the terrible part. None of it had been false at the time, but it had grown from a root planted in this hour, a friendless boy taking the first warmth offered, and Harry had decided on the rock that he would not plant that root again. Not because the Weasleys were not good. Because the version of him that grew from that root had ended chained to a ring, and he meant to grow a different version, one whose bonds were chosen with both eyes open and not stumbled into by a lonely child. So he watched Molly point the twins at the barrier, and he watched the first of them vanish into it. And then when he had the trick confirmed, the brick pillar between platforms 9 and 10, the casual lean-end walk, he pushed his own trolley toward it on his own, 20 feet from the Weasleys, and went through alone, and came out onto platform 9 3/4 under the great scarlet engine and the billowing steam, without having spoken a single word to the family that had once adopted him. It cost him something. He noted the cost and paid it and moved on. The Hogwarts Express stood steaming at the platform, gleaming in red, and the platform was filling with families and cats and owls and the high excited noise of children going to school. And Harry walked down it with his trunk until he found a compartment near the back that was empty, and he hauled his things in, and he sat by the window, and he waited to see who the morning would bring him. It brought him Neville first, which was exactly what he had hoped. The round-faced boy appeared in the corridor about 20 minutes out of London, red-eyed and frantic, peering into each compartment in turn. Sorry," he stammered, sliding Harry's door open. "Have you seen a toad? I've lost him. Gran's going to kill me." The first time Harry had barely registered Neville Longbottom in that first year, a clumsy, frightened, forgettable boy who lost things in melted cauldrons. It had taken Harry years and a war to understand what Neville actually was. The other boy the prophecy could have pointed to, raised in the shadow of parents tortured into madness, underestimated by everyone including himself, who had stood at the very end in the ruins of Hogwarts and pulled a sword out of a hat and cut the head off a snake while the world burned, the bravest person Harry had ever known wearing the disguise of the least. Neville had never betrayed anyone in his life. Neville had not been in the gallery. Harry had checked that memory on the rock with great care, and Neville Longbottom's face had not been among the 200. Neville had been one of the 4 or 5 people in the whole of Harry's first life who had loved him plainly and asked nothing for it, and Harry had decided of all the bonds he would re-earn that this was one he would not merely re-earn but build better and earlier than the first time around. "No," Harry said, "but I'll help you look. What's his name?" Neville blinked, thrown by the offer. "T. Trevor. He's a toad. He hates me, I think." "Toads don't hate," Harry said, rising. "They just don't have anywhere to be. Come on. We'll start at this end and work forward. If he's loose, he'll have gone for somewhere warm and dark, so check under the seats, not on them." They found Trevor 4 compartments up, wedged behind a radiator exactly where Harry had said a toad would go, and Neville's whole face transformed with gratitude and relief, and Harry handed him the warm, sulky amphibian and said, "Easy, come and sit with me if you like. I've got a whole compartment and nobody in it." It was the first deliberate bond of his second life, and he made it with his eyes wide open, and it felt, he let himself notice, clean, in a way almost nothing else had since the cupboard. Neville came and sat, clutching Trevor, and was shy and then less shy, and told Harry about his gran and his great-uncle Algy who had dropped him off Blackpool Pier to force the magic out of him. And Harry listened and asked the right questions and did not perform warmth because he did not have to, because this was the one relationship in the whole architecture of his plan that he could simply, uncomplicatedly have. He learned things, too, as he always learned things. That Neville's wand was his father's old one, which Harry knew was a mistake. A wand that had chosen another wizard would never serve Neville fully, and the boy's whole struggling first years had been half a matter of fighting a wand that did not fit his hand. Harry decided somewhere in that conversation that he would find a way to get Neville to Ollivanders for a wand of his own, sooner rather than later, because a Neville Longbottom with the right wand was a force, and Harry had watched that force come 20 years too late and had no intention of waiting this time. He said none of that. He just listened and let the round-faced boy relax into the first real friendliness an adult-minded thing had offered him, and watched the green country roll by and waited for the rest of the morning to arrive. Ron Weasley arrived at noon, and Harry had been ready for him for an hour. The door slid open, and there he was, tall for 11, freckled, a smudge of something on his nose, a fat gray rat asleep in his hands. Pettigrew. Harry's eyes went to the rat before they went to the boy, and he made himself move them back, because a boy who stared at another boy's pet was a boy who got remembered, and the rat could wait. The rat was a lever for a later month. "Anywhere else is full," Ron said, hovering. "Do you mind?" The first time Harry had said not at all and meant it, and that had been the whole hinge of a life. This time Harry looked up from the window and said, pleasantly enough, "Some seats free." "Neville's just here," and gestured at the compartment in a way that was welcoming to a stranger and not 1 degree warmer than that, not the eager, grasping welcome of a lonely boy who had found his first friend, but the easy courtesy of someone who had plenty and was sharing a little. Ron sat. He clocked the lightning scar within 30 seconds, the way he had the first time, his eyes going wide. Are you really, Harry?" "Yeah." He let the boy have the confirmation, flat and unremarkable, "as you confirm the weather." He did not lean into the fame. He did not, as he had the first time, feel a desperate, grateful pleasure at being liked. He watched Ron's face do the thing it did, the awe, and then, fast on its heels, the first faint flicker of something underneath it, the thing Harry had spent 20 years failing to see and now could not unsee. the ache of the youngest brother, the boy who had nothing new, suddenly sitting across from the most famous person in the country, and the awe was real, and so was the small sour comparison that started in that very instant to run underneath it. There it is, Harry thought without heat, right on schedule. Not a flaw, not a sin, just a crack in the wall, the same crack that would widen for 20 years until a grown man stood at a gallery wall and looked away. Ron Weasley was not a villain. He was a good and brave and loyal boy with one bad seam running through him, and the first time Harry had leaned the whole weight of his life against that wall and never once looked at the seam. This time he looked at it, and he did not lean. He was friendly. He was not cold. Coldness would draw attention, and besides, the boy had done nothing yet, and Harry did not punish in advance. He talked Quidditch and chocolate frogs and let Ron explain the rules of wizard chess, and he laughed in the right places. But he watched all afternoon, as you watch a card you've decided not to bet on, and he gave Ron Weasley precisely the warmth a pleasant train acquaintance earns, and not the warmth of a brother, and he watched the difference land on the boy without Ron understanding what was missing. There was a thing the first Harry had given freely in this compartment, total, instant, grateful loyalty, and the second Harry kept it in his pocket, and Ron felt the pocket stay closed even though he could not have named what was in it. It was Hermione who made the afternoon interesting. She came at 2, exactly as he remembered, bushy-haired and bossy and already in her robes, asking about Neville's toad in that breathless, correcting voice, and then catching sight of Ron's wand and demanding to see magic. And then, when Ron's spell about the rat turned out to be a fake, fixing them all with a look and reciting that she'd learned all the set books by heart and tried a few spells herself, and they'd all worked. "And I'm Hermione Granger, by the way. Who are you?" "Neville Longbottom," said Neville. "Harry Potter," said Harry. And he watched her as you watch the most important card on the table, as her eyes went to the scar and went round as she said, "Are you really?" and started reeling off the books he was in, and he held very still inside because here she was, 11 years old, frightened under the bossiness, brilliant and lonely and desperate to be useful, the girl who would choose him 100 times and weigh him against a kingdom once, the hand that had been on the parchment. Cleverest, most loyal, most dangerous person in the whole of his ruined life. She was not that woman yet. He had told himself so on the rock, and it was true, and the truth of it hit him harder in person than it had in the dark. There was no calculation in this child's face. There was only a desperate eagerness to be right and to be liked and to belong, and Harry, looking at it, felt the cold arithmetic of his plan meet the warm fact of the girl and grind just slightly against itself. So he tested her. He had decided he would, and he did it now in the smallest possible way because the first test should always be cheap. "You've read all the set books?" he asked, mild. "By heart?" "Well, of course," Hermione said, bridling, ready for mockery. "What does magical theory say about why first years can't apparate?" It was a real question with a real answer, buried in chapter 9 of a book Harry knew she'd read, and it was a test of 2 things at once, whether she'd actually read it or only said she had, and how she'd handle being asked to prove it. She lit up. The mockery she'd braced for hadn't come. Instead, a real question, a chance to be useful, and she seized it with both hands and gave him a clear, accurate, slightly breathless summary of the magical and legal reasons. And at the end of it she looked at him with a wary new respect because he'd asked her a real question and listened to the answer, which Harry understood, watching her face. Almost no one ever did. It was a small test and she'd passed it, not the big one. The big one would come later, Halloween, the troll, the moment in his first life when she'd lied to a teacher to protect 2 boys who'd been cruel to her. The first time she ever chose people over rules. He would watch for that. But this first cheap test told him something worth knowing, that the thing that made her dangerous and the thing that made her loyal were the same thing, the need to be right, to do it correctly, to matter, and that the whole question of Hermione Granger in both his lives came down to what she decided correctly meant when the cost got high enough. He drew no conclusion yet. He simply watched her and was courteous and gave her a real question now and then through the afternoon and let her earn, point by point, a provisional place at a table whose rules she did not know existed. Ron she'd already irritated. The 2 of them bickered, exactly as they had the first time, and Harry let them, and did not, as he had the first time, instinctively take Ron's side. He took no one's side. He sat in the middle of the compartment with Neville's toad and the green country flying past and 3 children who did not know they were being weighed, and he weighed them gently, and the train carried them all north toward the forge. The castle came up out of the dark across the black lake exactly as it had the first time. Every lit window held breath, and Harry sat in the little boat between Neville and a sandy-haired boy named Finch Fletchley, and felt the old wonder try to rise in him and let it for one beat, because some things deserved a beat even from a man who had seen them burn. Hagrid led them up to the great doors. Professor McGonagall met them, younger than Harry's memory of her, her hair not yet fully gray, her face stern and her eyes sharp, and Harry looked at her and felt a complicated thing, because Minerva McGonagall had not been in the gallery either. She had died in the war in the defense of the school, an old woman dueling 3 Death Eaters at once on the steps she'd climbed for 50 years. She had never had the chance to betray him. She had only ever been exactly what she appeared, hard, fair, fierce, and good. Harry added her quietly to the very short list. She gave the speech about the houses, the same speech, and left them in the little chamber off the hall to wait, and the others whispered nervously about how the sorting was done, Ron muttering about his brothers and trolls, Hermione murmuring spells under her breath, and Harry stood still in the middle of the frightened children and thought about the hat. He had a problem with the hat, and he had known he would, and he had decided how to handle it on the rock and refined the decision on the train. The sorting hat read minds, not the surface, the whole of you, the shape of your character, the bent of your will. And Harry was a 40-year-old veteran of a war that had not happened, carrying the memory of his own murder and a splinter of the Dark Lord's soul and a cold borrowed from the floor under the floor, wearing the body of an 11-year-old. The hat was going to put itself on his head and look inside and find what, he did not know. That was the danger. The hat reported to Dumbledore. A hat that recoiled or exclaimed or sat too long or said the wrong thing aloud was a flag run up the pole in front of the one man Harry needed never to look at him twice. So when his name was called, Potter Harry. And the hall broke into its whispering roar, and he walked up to the stool with the same blank-faced composure he'd worn through the whole evening. He sat, and the hat came down over his eyes, and he was ready. Well, said the small voice in his ear, and then it stopped. It stopped for a long moment. Harry felt it move through him, felt it touch the edges of the war, the courtyard, the cold, the splinter, and felt it flinch, the way a hand flinches off a hot stove, and then go very still and very quiet, and he understood, very careful. Oh, said the hat at last, softly, in a tone it had perhaps not used in 1,000 years of sortings. Oh, you poor creature, what have they done to you, what have you done? Sort me, Harry thought, calm and clear, addressing it directly because the hat could hear him and there was no point pretending otherwise. Sort me and say nothing aloud but the house. You read what's in me, then you know exactly why I do, the hat murmured. I have sorted murderers and saints and 3 Dark Lords, and I have never once sorted a thing that has stood where you have stood and come back. You are not a child, a pause, and you do not want me to say so. No. The man whose name I won't speak, he was here in this room in this hall 50 years ago, and I saw the same cold in him that I see in you, and I put him in Slytherin, and the world has not finished paying for it. The hat's voice was grave. You have it too, the ambition, the will to power. You would do extraordinary things in Slytherin, and you know exactly which strings to pull there, don't you? You could own that house by Christmas. I could, Harry agreed. I don't want to. No, said the hat, surprised. You don't? That is the difference between you and him, and it is the only one, and it is everything. Considered, you want Gryffindor. Not because you are brave, you are far past brave. Brave is for people who don't yet know what's coming, but because it is the board you know. The people you must watch are there, the legend you must wear is there. You would use the house as cover. Yes, that is a Slytherin's reason for choosing Gryffindor, the hat said, almost amused now. And the courage to walk knowingly back into the place that broke you, that is a Gryffindor's reason for being a Slytherin. You are not Harry Potter. I have not enjoyed a sorting this much in centuries. A pause, and then gently, almost kindly, I'll say nothing. You have my word for what an old hat's word is worth. But hear me first, because no one else in this castle can say it to you, and I may be the only one who ever will. The cold you carry will keep you alive, and it will cost you everything you came back to save if you let it run you. Trust is not weakness. It is the thing they took from you, and if you let the taking of it become the whole of who you are, then they win anyway, a second time, and the green light may as well have landed. Harry sat very still under the hat, and for one moment, one single moment in the dark under the brim, with the whole hall waiting, something in him that he had buried in a courtyard turned over just slightly. Sort me, he thought again, but it came out softer than before. Of course, said the hat, and then it shouted to the hall in its ordinary brassy voice with not one syllable of what had passed between them. Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table erupted. Harry pulled off the hat, handed it to McGonagall, and walked to the cheering table with his blank, composed face firmly back in place, and sat, and let the twins pump his hand and the prefect clap his shoulder, and across the hall at the high table, he felt rather than saw the pale blue eyes find him and rest on him with the mild, benevolent interest of a man examining a piece he had placed exactly where he wanted it. Harry did not look up at the eyes. He looked at his empty plate, an ordinary nervous first year, and he let Albus Dumbledore see exactly that, and nothing else, and he tucked the hat's warning down into the cold place with everything else, to be taken out and examined later in private when he could afford it. He could not, it turned out, entirely keep Dumbledore from noticing him. He had known that going in. A man as old and as watchful as Dumbledore noticed everything. The trick was not to be invisible, but to be exactly as visible as the legend required, and not one shade more. He managed it through the feast. He ate modestly. He answered Percy Weasley's pompous questions with a boy's vague politeness. He let himself be introduced to nearly headless Nick, and reacted with the right amount of delight. And when Dumbledore rose to give the start-of-term notices, the warning about the third-floor corridor, out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a most painful death, which was the stone's first public thread, dangled in front of the whole school like bait, which it was. Harry watched the old man over the top of his goblet and let nothing at all show on his face. But once, near the end of the feast, the scar on his forehead seared white-hot. It was the same moment as the first time Snape, at the high table, looking past the turban beside him, and the wraith on the back of Quirrell's skull turning its attention briefly outward, and the link between the splinter in Harry's head and the ruin behind Quirrell's flaring to sudden life. The first time Harry had clapped a hand to his scar and gasped, and Percy had asked if he was all right. This time Harry was ready, and he did not gasp. He felt it come, the white spike of pain, the splinter waking and leaning toward its larger self, and he met it with the wall he had been rebuilding all summer, the discipline of a man who had cast spells with worse than a headache, and he clamped down so hard and so fast that the pain folded back into a dull pressure behind his eyes, and his face did not move at all. He set his goblet down unhurried and pressed the cold of it briefly to his temple as though the hall were simply too warm, and the moment passed, and no one at the Gryffindor table noticed anything, and more importantly, the thing behind Quirrell's turban, which had reached out half-idly to taste the famous boy's scar, found the door slammed in its face. That was the danger, and he knew it the instant it happened. A boy whose scar hurt and who flinched was a boy. A boy whose scar hurt and who shut a thing out cleanly, completely, with the trained reflex of an Occlumens was not a boy, and the thing behind the turban was the second most dangerous reader of people in the castle, and it had just felt a wall where a child's open mind should have been. He felt the wraith's attention sharpen on him, exactly as Quirrell's had in the leaky cauldron, the cold old interest of a thing that had expected a lamb and brushed against steel. Harry made a decision in the space of a breath. He could not undo the wall had already shown. So he gave the Watcher something else to explain it with. He let his face crumple, a beat late, into a child's wince. He raised a hand to his scar and rubbed it and looked, for just a moment, confused and uncomfortable, the very picture of a boy with an odd, inexplicable headache he did not understand. He turned to Percy and asked in a small voice who the teacher with the greasy hair was, the one looking at him, and Percy said that was Professor Snape. He taught potions, but everyone knew he wanted Quirrell's job, and Harry nodded and let his face show a boy's nervous dislike of the unsmiling man at the high table, and the wraith behind the turban, watching, was given a story. The boy's scar hurt near old dark magic. The boy didn't know why. The boy was unsettled and ignorant and afraid, exactly as a boy should be. It might hold, it might not. A thing as old and patient as the wraith did not forget an anomaly just because it had been handed a plausible cover. But it was the best he could do in the moment, and it bought him time, and time was the only currency Harry truly needed, because every day the wraith and the architect both spent believing he was a child was a day Harry spent becoming something neither of them could stop. He looked away from the high table and down at his plate, and the feast wound to its end, and Dumbledore sent them all to bed. The first-year boys' dormitory was a round stone room high in Gryffindor Tower, 5 four-poster beds with hangings of deep red, a fire dying in the grate, and the smell of clean linen and old stone. The others fell into bed exhausted and overexcited, Ron talking until he wasn't, Neville asleep almost before his head touched the pillow, with Trevor croaking somewhere in the dark. And Harry lay in the bed that had been his bed in another life, in the same room, under the same hangings, and waited until the breathing all around him had gone slow and even, and then he opened his eyes in the dark and took stock of where he stood. He was inside. That was the thing to mark. 6 weeks ago he had been a body chained to a ring. Tonight he was lying in Gryffindor Tower with a wand that knew him under his pillow and a trunk full of carefully chosen books at the foot of his bed, and 3 people in the castle already added to the short list. The whole impossible thing it held. The siege had run as remembered. The alley had given up everything he asked of it. The hat had kept its word. The wraith had been handed its lie, and Snape had docked no points. He had walked back into the forge, and the forge had not yet noticed that the metal it picked up was already a blade. He let himself have that, the cold satisfaction of a plan's first phase closing clean, for exactly as long as it was useful. Then he turned to the harder thing, which was the hat. Trust is not weakness. It is the thing they took from you. The old voice had said it gently in the one place in the castle where no one could overhear, and Harry had carried it up here to look at because a warning he refused to examine was a warning that would steer him blind. He examined it now. The hat was not wrong about the danger. Harry had seen in the war what men became when they let a wound make all their decisions, had watched good people curdle into something that won battles and lost everything worth winning them for. The cold could run him. He knew it could. He could feel even now the pull of the easy version of his second life, the one where he trusted no one ever again and ground the whole world into pieces small enough to control and called the grinding safety. But the hat was also wrong about one thing, and Harry let himself name it in the dark, because precision mattered even against an ancient artifact's kindness. The hat thought the choice was between trust and coldness. It was not. The choice was between trust extended on credit and trust extended on proof, and those were not the same thing at all. Harry had not stopped being able to love, Neville on the train had proven that, and Hagrid in the shack, and the complicated ache he had felt watching the Weasleys come through the barrier. He had only stopped handing love out to anyone who happened to be standing nearby when he was lonely. That was not the death of trust, it was the discipline of it. And if he held the line warm with the proven few, cold with the unproven many, and ruthlessly honest with himself about which was which, then he could keep the thing the Hat was afraid he'd lose without losing the thing that had got him killed. It was a fine line. He knew it was a fine line. He would not always walk it cleanly. The Hat was right that the cold would tempt him toward the easy side of it every single day. But a man who knew exactly where the line was and exactly which way he tended to fall off it was a man who could catch himself, and Harry had spent a whole summer learning to catch himself, and he intended to spend the next 7 years getting better at it. He set the warning down not in the cold place this time, but somewhere nearer the front, somewhere he would see it, because some things you keep in plain sight precisely so they can argue with you. Then, finally, he turned to the work. Tomorrow the lessons began, and the lessons were the cover. The real work would happen in the hours the lessons left empty, and he laid out the first weeks of it now, lying in the dark the way a man lays out a campaign. The core had to grow, and growing it meant using it daily to the edge of exhaustion and not past the marble of light, then harder things in private where no one counted. The mind had to be fortified. The Wraith had felt his wall tonight, and a wall glimpsed once had to become a wall too perfect to glimpse again, which meant occlumency, real occlumency, rebuilt from the book in his trunk. And there was a room in this castle on the 7th floor behind a stretch of blank wall that became whatever its summoner most needed. And inside that room, gathering dust in a mountain of 1,000 years, hidden things, sat a tarnished diadem that was a piece of a soul, and Harry knew exactly where it was, and he was the only living person who did, and that knowledge was a card so large he had not yet decided how to play it. He would find the room first. That was the next move. Everything else could wait on it. He closed his eyes, and the cold settled at the base of him. Patient lent, and somewhere below in the sleeping castle the architect's traps lay waiting, and the Wraith drank its stolen blood, and the board sat exactly as everyone but Harry believed it to be set. He let his breathing go slow to match the others. He had a war to build and 7 years to build it, and for the first time in either life, the time and the quiet and the foreknowledge to build it right. He slept. In the morning the lessons would begin, so would everything else. The dungeon was cold and the cauldrons gleamed, and Severus Snape swept into the first potions lesson of the year exactly as Harry remembered him, black robes billowing, voice low and dangerous. The roll call paused on the famous name. "Ah yes," Snape said softly, his black eyes fixing on Harry. "Harry Potter, our new celebrity." The first time, this had been the opening of a feud that lasted 7 years and cost them both more than either could afford, because the boy Harry had looked at Severus Snape and seen only cruelty, and had answered the cruelty with the sullen defiance of a wounded child, and neither of them had ever climbed out of the hole they dug that first morning. Harry had learned the truth too late, that the unbearable man hated him because he looked like James and had Lily's eyes, that he had loved Lily Evans his whole bitter life, that he was Dumbledore's man, and a spy of staggering courage who would die for the cause with the dark mark on his arm and Lily's name on his lips. Harry had learned all of it from a flask of memory in the last hour of the war, and he had named a son for the man, and it had never been enough, because Snape had died believing Harry hated him as much as he pretended to hate Harry. This time Harry was not going to dig the hole. The questions came, as he knew they would, the trap questions, designed to humiliate, the ones the first time Harry could not possibly have answered. Potter. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormhood? The whole class held its breath. Hermione's hand shot into the air. And Harry, who had brewed draught of living death in a tent in the wilderness, who had forgotten more potions than most masters ever learned, looked up at Snape with a calm, respectful face and answered, "The draught of living death, sir, a very strong sleeping potion." A pause, neither smug nor sullen. "Asphodel and wormhood, sir, I read that it's an old way of saying a kind of grief. I thought that was why it puts you so deep under." The dungeon went silent. That was not in the book. That was the etymology, the lily of the field and the bitterness, the deep old poetry of the thing, and it was, Harry knew, precisely the kind of detail that Severus Snape, true master of the subtle art, loved and almost never found in a student, and it was also, though Harry kept his face perfectly innocent, a thing that touched the man's whole life. Asphodel was a kind of lily, and wormhood was bitter regret, and Snape had built his bitter, regretful life around a girl named for a flower. Snape's black eyes narrowed. Something flickered behind them, surprise and then suspicion, and then beneath both, against the man's will, the faint, involuntary respect of a craftsman who has heard a true note where he expected a clumsy one. "Where," Snape said very slowly, "did you read that, Potter?" "In one of the books I bought, sir. I don't remember which. I read a lot this summer." Harry let a boy's slight defensiveness color it, as though braced for mockery. "I didn't understand most of it. But that part I remembered because it was sad. It was a careful answer, and Harry knew it. It explained the knowledge, a bookish boy reading over his head without revealing the mind behind it. It gave Snape no defiance to punish and no ignorance to mock. And it dropped gently in front of the one man besides Dumbledore who had loved Lily Evans, a note about grief and flowers and deep sleep, a note Snape could not possibly trace and could not possibly ignore. Snape stared at him for a long moment. The class waited for the points to be docked, the sneer, the cruelty. It did not come. Instead, Snape turned away, his robe snapping, and said to the room in a flat voice, "A point to Gryffindor for reading." And then, recovering sharper, "Well, why are you all not copying that down?" Quills scratched. The lesson resumed. And Harry, bending over his cauldron, knew he had not made Severus Snape an ally that would take years, if it was possible at all, but he had done the one thing that mattered this morning. He had refused to dig the hole. He had given the bitter, brilliant, grieving man no reason to hate him on sight, and a small reason against all the man's instincts to be curious instead. The feud that had cost them both so much in the first life had not started this time. That was a thing changed. A small thing, a first thing, but the timeline had a new crack in it now, running quietly through a cold dungeon, and it was a crack Harry had put there on purpose. He brewed his potion correctly, neither too well nor too badly, an able first year and nothing more. Beside him, Neville's cauldron hissed and threatened to melt, and Harry caught it, a hand on the boy's wrist, a quiet word, "Take it off the heat, add the quills one at a time," and steadied it before Snape could descend, so that for once Neville Longbottom finished a lesson without disaster and walked out of the dungeon with his head a little higher than he'd walked in. It was a small kindness, and it cost Harry nothing, and it was the second deliberate thing he had done for Neville in 2 days, and he did it because Neville had earned it across a whole first life, and because, he was beginning to understand, the hat had not been entirely wrong in the dark under the brim. The cold would keep him alive. But a man who was only cold was a man already half dead, already half the thing they had decided to destroy, and Harry had not clawed his way up off the floor under the floor to come back as a colder copy of his own murderers. He would be careful. He would trust no loyalty on credit. He would watch the crack in Ron and test the steel in Hermione and give Dumbledore exactly the pawn he expected to see. But he would also keep the short list, Hagrid, Neville, McGonagall, the handful who had never once let him down, and he would let those bonds be warm, eyes open, chosen, because that was the difference between surviving his second life and merely repeating his first more cleverly. Walked up out of the dungeon into the light of the entrance hall, Neville beside him talking happily about not melting his cauldron, and somewhere far above, in a circular office, an old man made a note in a private ledger that the Potter boy was settling in well, quiet, clever, a little solitary, nothing remarkable, and was satisfied and was wrong and did not yet know how wrong and would not know for a long time, which was exactly the amount of time Harry needed. The forge had taken him back. This time he was going to choose what it made. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Building power early. Harry found the room of requirement on the 9th night of term, and he did not have to look for it because he already knew the trick of it, and knowing was the whole of his advantage in this second life. He had waited the 9 nights on purpose. A first year who vanished from the common room in his first week was a first year someone wondered about. A first year who had spent 9 evenings being visibly ordinary, doing his homework by the fire, losing at wizard chess to Ron with good grace, helping Neville with his charms wand work, was a first year no one watched when he slipped out under cover of a trip to the library. He had the route memorized. He had walked it 10,000 times in another life. Up the moving stairs, along the 7th floor corridor, past the idiotic tapestry of Barnabas the barmy teaching trolls to dance, and there, the stretch of blank wall opposite, where you walked 3 times and wanted. He wanted a place to train, unseen, unheard, and on the 3rd pass the door grew out of the stone, and he stepped through it into a high bare room with a sprung wooden floor and walls that drank sound, and the door sealed behind him, and for the first time since the cupboard Harry Potter was alone in a place where no one in the world could find him. He stood in the middle of the floor and let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 9 nights, and then he got to work. He had a regimen. He had designed it on the rock and refined it in the dark of the dormitory, and it had 3 pillars, and he attacked all 3 with the patience of a man who had nothing but time and the discipline of a man who knew exactly what wasting it cost. The first pillar was the core. A wizard's raw capacity grew the way a muscle grew with use, taken to the edge of failure and then rested, and a child's core grew faster than an adult's because it was young and pliable and still forming. Harry meant to exploit that ruthlessly. He cast in that soundproof room until his hands shook and his vision swam and the magic guttered in his grip, and then he stopped exactly at the edge, never passed it, and sat against the wall and let it refill. He had learned the danger of past the edge in the war. A wizard who emptied his core completely could damage it, could leave himself a squib for weeks or a cripple for life, and Harry had no intention of crippling the instrument he was trying to sharpen. So he danced along the edge night after night, light and levitation in the simplest shield over and over, not for the spells themselves. He could have cast every one of them in his sleep, but for the burn, the growth, the slow daily expansion of the well. The second pillar was the mind, and it was the one that frightened him, because it was the one the wraith had already touched. He sat cross-legged on the sprung floor and rebuilt his occlumency from the foundation up, the way he had been forced to rebuild it in the war after Voldemort had cracked his defenses wide and used the crack to bait him into the Department of Mysteries. He had been a disaster at occlumency as a boy, too angry, too open, the worst possible student for the worst possible teacher. He was not a boy now. He knew the architecture of his own mind, every room and corridor of it, and he built the walls deliberately, not a blank fortress, which a skilled legilimens recognized instantly as a fortress and therefore as a thing hiding something, but a false front, an ordinary child's mind laid over the real one like a stage set over a vault. Surface thoughts about Quidditch and homework and the boy in the next bed who snored. A plausible, dull, 11-year-old interior, complete and convincing, with the whole of the war and the courtyard and the cold sealed away behind it where no probe would think to look. It was the hardest work he did in that room, harder than the core, and he did an hour of it every night because the wraith had felt his wall once, and a thing as patient as the wraith would test that wall again. The third pillar was the splinter. He left it for the end of each session when he was tired and calm and least likely to do something rash, and he went down into himself and sat with the piece of soul behind his scar and studied it. He did not try to remove it, he did not yet know how, and a man who experiments on the live thing in his own skull is a man with a death wish, but he learned it. He learned that it strengthened when the wraith was near and stilled when the wraith was far. He learned that it carried very faintly an echo of the larger ruin's moods, and that the echo ran both ways, which was the danger, and also he was coming to believe the opportunity. Because a connection that ran both ways was a door, and a door that the enemy believed only he could open was a door the enemy would never think to guard from the other side. He did not push on the door yet. He only learned where its hinges were. That was enough for now. Everything in this second life was enough for now. The whole of his strategy was the patience to let small advantages compound into large ones while his enemies mistook his stillness for weakness. Finding the diadem took him 3 more nights, and it was the first thing in either of his lives that made his hands go still with something close to awe. He knew it was in the castle. Everyone who had fought the last war knew, by the end, what the Room of Requirement could become, the Room of Hidden Things, the vast junk cathedral where 1,000 years of Hogwarts students had stashed what they wanted gone, and where, in a niche on a bust of an ugly old warlock, under a moth-eaten wig and a tarnished tiara, Voldemort had hidden a piece of his own soul and forgotten it was a place anyone else could reach. Harry had found it there the first time in the last desperate days, with the castle under siege and Crabbe's cursed fire about to swallow the whole room and the diadem with it. He had nearly died for that one. The fiend-fire had taken the diadem and 3 students with it, and very nearly Harry too. This time he walked into the Room of Hidden Things on a quiet Tuesday night with no fire and no siege and no one hunting him, and he walked the towering aisles of forgotten junk, the broken vanishing cabinets, the blood-stained axes, the cages and the bottles and the cursed jewels of 100 generations, until he came to the bust of the ugly warlock with the dusty wig, and there, exactly where it had been, exactly where it would be, sat the lost diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw with a fragment of the Dark Lord's soul coiled inside it like a worm in an apple. He did not touch it. He stood in front of it with the light of his wand held low and looked at it for a long time. He could feel it, not with his hands, with the splinter, with the piece of the same soul that lived behind his own scar, which leaned toward the diadem as the larger wraith made it lean toward Quirrell, recognition calling to recognition across the dusty dark. The 2 fragments knew each other. They were the same severed thing, scattered, and some buried instinct in each of them wanted to be whole. Harry held the splinter down hard behind his occlumency walls and made it be still and studied the diadem cold. Here was a card the size of the sky. He had it now, 11 years before he had found it the first time, in a quiet room with no fire and no enemies, and it was one of the anchors that held Voldemort to the world. Destroy this and the cup and Gringotts and the locket and the ring and the diary and the snake, and the Dark Lord could be killed and stay dead, and the war that forged Harry into a weapon need never happen at all. The whole horror of his first life had been finding the anchors too late and one at a time, hunted, half-starved, paying in blood for every one. And here was one of them, in a room only Harry could find, waiting. But he did not touch it, and he made himself understand exactly why, because the temptation to seize it was enormous, and the temptation was also a trap. He did not yet have a way to destroy it. The diary had been killed with a basilisk fang. The ring and the locket had taken the sword of Gryffindor, goblin-forged and venom-soaked. Ordinary magic did not touch a Horcrux, and a clumsy attempt might wake it, might let the fragment lash out, might draw the larger wraith's attention straight to the boy who had found its hidden soul. And there was a deeper reason, the one that mattered most. The diadem, sitting here undisturbed, was safe. No one else knew where it was. No one else could reach it. As long as it sat in this niche gathering dust, it was a soul anchor Harry controlled completely. by the simple fact of being the only person alive who knew it existed, and a controlled enemy asset left in place was worth more, for now, than a destroyed one that announced its own destruction. He would come back for it. When he had the means, the fang, the sword, or the other thing he was beginning to suspect, the deeper possibility that lived in the door between the splinter and the wraith, he would unmake it cleanly and quietly and at a moment of his own choosing. Until then he marked its place, and he laid a single near-invisible tripping charm of his own across the niche, a thread that would tell him if anything ever moved it, and he left it where it lay. He walked out of the room of hidden things into the 7th-floor corridor with the cold settling at the base of him and the knowledge sitting in him like a swallowed coal, and for the first time he let himself believe, fully and without hedging, that he was going to win. Not survive, win. The thing that had killed him twice over, once with the war and once with the courtyard, had a beating heart hidden in a tiara in a junk room, and Harry knew where it was, and the people who had executed him did not even know there was a war. He spent his pocket capital that autumn, the way he spent everything, on advantage that compounded. A letter went to the director of hereditary accounts at Gringotts, written in his own hand this time, formal and courteous, in the old register he had used on Griffhook, asking to be sent a full accounting of the Potter estate, the properties and the entailments and the seats, and asking, almost in passing, whether the bank offered any service by which a young heir might learn to manage what would one day be his. The reply came back within the week on heavy cream parchment sealed with the bank's mark, and it was longer and warmer than any letter a goblin had ever troubled to send the boy in his first life, because Harry had asked the one thing wizards never asked, to learn the value of the thing rather than merely to spend it, and the goblins, who valued craft and the honest keeping of accounts above almost anything, found a wizard child who spoke their language a novelty worth answering. They sent him an introductory ledger and an invitation to correspond. Harry corresponded. It cost him an hour a week and a careful courtesy, and it was the steady watering of a root that would, he knew, be a tree by the time he needed shade. But the move he valued most that autumn cost no gold at all, and it was the one he made for Neville. He had decided on the train that Neville Longbottom was fighting his magic with a dead man's wand, and across 2 months of watching the boy struggle through charms, the spells half-firing, the wand work technically perfect and magically inert, Harry confirmed it. Frank Longbottom's wand had chosen Frank Longbottom. It would lie sullen in any other hand, including his son's, giving up a fraction of what it owed a true master, and Neville, who had no way to know that the fault was the tool and not himself, had built his whole shaky confidence around the assumption that he was simply bad at magic. Harry could not march him to Ollivander's. First years did not leave the castle. So he did the next thing, which was to show the boy the truth in a way the boy could not argue with. He took Neville to the room of requirement on a Saturday, told him only that he'd found somewhere quiet to practice, which was true, and in the soundproof room he said, "Easy, try the levitation charm with mine," and held out the holly wand. Neville balked. "I couldn't. That's yours, you don't lend your." "It's a wand, not my toothbrush," Harry said. "Go on, swish and flick, just once." Neville took the holly wand the way you take something you expect to drop, and pointed it at the feather Harry had conjured, and said the words, and the feather shot to the ceiling and stuck there, and Neville Longbottom stood with his mouth open and his great-uncle's dead wand forgotten in his other hand, and looked at the holly wand as though it had spoken to him. That's never," he could not finish. "That's you," Harry said quietly. "That's what you can do when the wand's not fighting you. Your gran gave you your dad's wand because she wanted you to be your dad, but you're not your dad, Neville. You're better, you just can't prove it through a wand that belongs to a man who's not using it anymore." He took the holly wand back gently and pressed the truth home while it would land. "Write your gran, tell her you need your own wand. If she won't take it from you, get her to take it from a healer or from Professor McGonagall. There's no shame in it. It's like wearing someone else's glasses and wondering why you can't read. None of this was ever your fault." Neville's eyes were wet, and for once it was not from being laughed at. He wrote his gran that night. It would take weeks and an argument and a stern letter from McGonagall that Harry quietly made sure she had reason to send, but by the new year Neville Longbottom would hold a wand of cherry and unicorn hair that had chosen him, and the boy who had been the castle's joke would begin, 2 years early, the slow climb into the person who one day pulled a sword out of a hat. Harry had not made it happen with a spell. He had made it happen by telling one frightened boy a true thing nobody else had bothered to tell him, and it was, of all the moves he made that autumn, the one that cost the least and the one he was gladdest of. The first visible divergence came at Halloween, and Harry made it on purpose, and it cost him a sleepless week of second-guessing before he decided it was worth it. The troll was coming. He knew it to the hour. Quirrell would burst into the Halloween feast crying about a troll in the dungeons and then faint, and in the chaos a mountain troll would end up in the second-floor girls' bathroom where Hermione Granger was crying because Ron had been cruel about her, and the first time Harry and Ron had gone after her and knocked the troll out and forged, in that bathroom, the friendship of 3 children that became the spine of everything. The first time, it had been an accident. This time Harry had a choice, and the choice was the first real fork in his second life, and he turned it over for a week before Halloween. He could let it run exactly as before, go to the bathroom with Ron, save Hermione, forge the bond. But that put him back on the first life's rails, and worse, it bound him to Ron in the old way, the two of them shoulder to shoulder against the monster, the grateful Trinity reborn. He did not want that. He could prevent it entirely, warn a teacher, get Hermione out of the bathroom before the troll ever reached it, but a first year who knew where the troll would be was a first year who had just told the whole staff he knew things he could not possibly know. So he chose a third path, and it was a path that served 3 purposes at once, which was how Harry liked his moves. When Quirrell came shrieking into the feast about the troll and crumpled to the floor and the hall erupted, and Dumbledore sent the students to their dormitories, Harry slipped sideways in the crowd, not toward Gryffindor Tower with the others, but quietly out a side door because he knew Hermione was not in the hall, knew she was in the bathroom, not knowing the troll was loose, and he was going to get her out, not with Ron, alone. He found her exactly where memory said, sniffling in a cubicle, and he did not knock the troll out in a blaze of glory, because the troll had not arrived yet. He had timed it to get there first. "Hermione," he said, low and urgent, "you have to come with me right now. There's a troll loose in the school, and it's coming this way." She came out red-eyed and indignant and disbelieving. How could you possibly know where it's? And then the bathroom door groaned and the smell hit, the foul reek of troll, and the great grey nightmare ducked through the doorway with its club dragging, and Hermione's protest died in her throat. What happened next was the test, and Harry watched it as carefully as he had watched anything in either life. He did not save her by overpowering the troll, though he could have. He saved her by being calm, by moving her behind him and putting himself between the girl and the club, by using the simplest possible magic, a precise levitation, not of the club, which the first time Harry had done by luck, but of a heavy stone basin off its pedestal, swung up and down onto the creature's skull with the economy of a man who had killed worse things in worse places. One motion, clean, no flourish, the troll down and out before it had finished its first swing. He had wanted to see whether he could do it small and quiet, and he could, and that told him something useful about how far his core had already come. But that was not the test. The test came after. Because the teachers arrived within the minute, McGonagall white-faced, Snape limping and furious, Quirrell whimpering, and they found a first-year boy and a first-year girl standing over an unconscious mountain troll, and McGonagall demanded in a voice of pure terror dressed as fury what on earth they thought they were doing. And Harry watched Hermione Granger choose. The first time in the first life she had lied. She had drawn herself up and told Professor McGonagall that she had gone looking for the troll herself, that she'd read about them and thought she could handle one, that it was her fault and the boys had only come to save her, a rule-breaking, authority-defying, self-sacrificing lie told by a girl who had never broken a rule in her life, to protect 2 boys who had been unkind to her. It had been the single most important thing Hermione ever did, because it was the moment the rule follower decided that people mattered more than rules, and it was the seed of everything she became, good and terrible both. Harry held his breath inside behind the walls and waited to see if she would do it again and whether she would do it for him. She did. "It was my fault, Professor," Hermione said in a small, steady voice, lifting her chin. "I read about trolls and I thought I could deal with one on my own. If Harry hadn't come and found me, I'd be dead. He didn't go looking for it. He came to warn me and get me out, and there wasn't time." She met McGonagall's eyes and did not waver. "Please don't blame him. He saved my life." There it was, the same choice, the same lie, told for the same reason, people over rules, offered freely at cost to herself, to shield someone who had done her a kindness. And Harry, watching it, felt the cold arithmetic of his plan meet the warm fact of the girl a second time, and this time it did not grind. This time something in him eased just slightly, because here was proof, not credit, proof, that the thing in Hermione Granger that would one day design a merciful murder was the very same thing that would, tonight, lie to a teacher to protect a boy she'd known for 2 months. The loyalty and the danger were one substance. And Harry understood, standing in the wreckage of the bathroom with the troll snoring at his feet, that the whole of his future with her would be a matter of keeping the substance pointed at loyalty and never letting the world convince her that murdering him was the correct and merciful thing to do. He could do that. He thought, watching her lift her chin at McGonagall, that he could actually do that, that the woman in the gallery had not been inevitable, that she had been made slowly, by years of being taught that the realm was worth more than any single person, and that a Hermione raised differently, valued differently, shown a Harry who trusted her with the truth in careful, measured doses instead of a Harry who became a weapon she had to weigh against a kingdom, that Hermione might never pick up the pen at all. It was the first time he had let himself believe that a betrayer might simply be unmade rather than outmaneuvered. He held the belief at arm's length, provisional, unproven past this one night, but he held it. McGonagall, against every regulation, awarded Gryffindor 5 points for sheer dumb luck and dangerous nerve and sent them to bed, and Harry walked Hermione back toward the tower through the dark corridors, and she was quiet for a long while, and then she said in a careful voice, "How did you know where the troll was going to be?" And Harry, who had been ready for this question for a week, gave her the answer he had built. "I didn't. I knew where you were. You weren't at the feast, and Ron been horrible to you, so I figured you were off somewhere on your own crying, and the only place near here you could be was that bathroom. When Quirrell said the troll was in the dungeons, I thought dungeons are below us, trolls go up looking for food, and you were alone and didn't know, so I came." A boy's shrug. "I got lucky on the timing." It was true in every particular and false in its whole, which was the only kind of lie Harry told anymore. And Hermione looked at him sidelong in the torchlight with an expression he could not entirely read, gratitude and curiosity, and the dawning of a respect that was different from the respect she gave to books, and she said, "Thank you, Harry," very quietly, and meant it more than she had words for, and Harry said, "Any time," and meant it more than she could know. He had not made a friend on credit. He had earned one and been earned by one in a bathroom with a troll on his own terms with both eyes open. The first true divergence of his second life was not a spell or a stolen artifact. It was a girl who, in this version of the world, had a Harry who came for her alone and looked at her like a person and not a tool from the very first month, and that small change, Harry suspected, might in the end matter more than the diadem. The second divergence he set in motion 3 weeks later, and it was the cold one, the surgical one, and it had a name, and the name was Peter Pettigrew. The rat had been sleeping in Ron Weasley's pocket all term, Scabbers, the family hand-me-down, 12 years old and missing a toe, which no one had ever found strange because no one knew that a rat does not live 12 years, and that a rat with a missing toe was, to anyone who knew the story, a man with a missing finger, the finger he had cut from his own hand to fake his death and frame an innocent man. Sirius Black sat in Azkaban for a murder Pettigrew committed and 12 deaths Pettigrew caused, and the only witness who could clear him was asleep in a boy's pocket 2 floors below the Gryffindor dormitory. Harry had thought about how to do this for a long time because it was delicate. He could not simply announce that Ron's rat was a man. A first-year accusing a pet of being a fugitive Death Eater was a first-year who got a kind word and a referral to Madame Pomfrey. He needed the rat caught and revealed to someone with the authority to act and the wit to believe their own eyes, and he needed it done in a way that never once pointed back at him as the source of impossible knowledge. So he built it carefully across 3 weeks, the way he built everything now. First, he made certain the rat noticed nothing. Pettigrew in his rat form was a coward and a survivor with a survivor's instincts, and an animagus who felt himself watched would bolt and vanish into the castle's 10,000 cracks and never be seen again. So Harry did nothing to Scabbers at all, was, if anything, idly kind to the creature when Ron brought it out, fed it crusts, asked after its health, made himself the last person in the castle the rat would flee from. Second, he arranged for the rat to be found out by the right person, and he did it with a letter. He wrote it left-handed on plain parchment in a careful disguised hand, and he posted it from the village through a route that could not be traced to first year, and he addressed it to the office of Amelia Bones at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Amelia Bones, who in his first life had been the one honest senior official in a corrupt ministry, the woman who had given Harry a fair hearing when no one else would and who had died for her integrity in the war's worst year. The letter was short. It said that the rat kept as a pet by the Weasley family at Hogwarts, called Scabbers, an unusually old rat missing a single toe, was worth examining for the spell signature of an unregistered animagus, and that the office might compare any finding against the records of the wizard Peter Pettigrew, presumed dead in 1981. It said nothing else. It was signed a friend of justice, which was the kind of thing cranks signed, and Harry knew that most such letters were thrown away. But Amelia Bones did not throw away letters that were specific, and this one was specific in a way no crank could have managed: a particular rat, a particular missing toe, a particular dead man, a particular spell to cast. Harry was betting on the one official in Britain who would rather waste an afternoon checking a mad tip than risk ignoring a true one. It was a long bet. It might fail. If it failed, he had lost nothing but a piece of parchment and could try again by another road. If it succeeded, then somewhere in the next weeks an auror would arrive quietly at Hogwarts, and a fat gray rat would be examined and would try to flee and would be caught and would be forced back into the shape of a sweating, balding, finger-missing little man, and the whole edifice of Sirius Black's false imprisonment would come down in an afternoon, and Sirius Black, who had died for Harry in the first life through a veil in the Department of Mysteries, baited by a lie, would walk free 12 years early, owing his freedom to a letter from a friend he did not know he had. Harry did not tell anyone he had written it, not Hermione, not Neville, not the headmaster, not a soul. He posted it and let it go and turned his attention back to the core and the walls and the diadem and the long patient compounding of advantage, and he waited to see whether the cold surgical move would land. It was Snape who first realized that something in the castle had changed, and Harry watched the realization happen across November like a man watching a slow tide come in. Snape was the most dangerous reader of people at Hogwarts after Dumbledore, and Snape had spent 11 years braced to hate James Potter's son, and instead he had got a boy who answered his cruelty with calm, who knew the poetry of potions, who never gave him the defiance he needed to justify the loathing he had prepared. It unsettled the man. Harry could see it unsettling him, the narrowed eyes in the dungeon, the trick questions that Harry answered just well enough and never too well, the gaze that followed him out of the room. Snape did not know what was wrong. He only knew, with a spy's instinct honed across 2 decades of double-dealing, that the Potter boy did not behave like any child he had ever taught, and that the wrongness of it itched at him. And then on a gray afternoon in late November, the thing behind Quirrell came for Harry directly. It happened in an empty stretch of fourth-floor corridor, and it was not an accident. Harry understood that at once. Quirrell was there alone, the turban tall and absurd, ostensibly correcting an essay against the wall, and as Harry came past alone too, on his way back from the owlery, the stammering man straightened and said, with hardly a stammer at all, "M. Mr. Potter." A M moment. The corridor was empty, the torches guttered, and Harry felt the wraith's attention come down on him like a cold hand on the back of the neck, and under it, sharp and unmistakable, the soft pressure of a Legilimen's reaching for the surface of his mind, not Quirrell's clumsy probe, but the other thing, the old terrible intelligence behind the turban, reaching out through its host to read the famous child it could not account for. A boy would have felt nothing, or a vague unease. Harry felt the whole shape of the attack and met it without moving a muscle of his face. He let the false front stand, the dull, plausible child mind, the surface thoughts about homework and dinner in the cold corridor, and he held the vault sealed behind it, and he let the wraith look, and find exactly the boy it expected to find, and not one grain more. It pressed, he held. The pressure was enormous, the patient grinding weight of a thing that had broken the minds of grown wizards, and Harry stood in the empty corridor wearing a child's idle confusion on his face and held the line with everything the summer and the room had taught him, and gave the wraith nothing. "Sir," he said in a boy's small, uncertain voice, letting just enough discomfort show to be plausible. "Is this something wrong? My scar's gone funny again. Does that near you? I don't know why." It was the perfect thing to say, and he had been holding it ready for weeks. It acknowledged the link which the wraith could feel and would distrust a denial of while framing it as a child's helpless ignorance. "My scar does that near you, and I don't know why." It gave the wraith the story it wanted. The boy felt the connection. The boy did not understand it. The boy was exactly the unwitting marked lamb the prophecy had promised. The pressure withdrew, slowly, baffled and unsatisfied. Quirrell's watery eyes blinked, and the stammer came flooding back. "And nothing, Potter, nothing at all. Your scar, yes, old magic, very sea curious. Run along now." And Harry ran along, an ordinary boy hurrying away from an odd teacher, and did not let his shoulders unlock until he was 3 corridors away, and then he stood against a wall in the dark and breathed, because he had just held his mind shut against the Dark Lord himself, at 11 years old and 1. And because the very fact that he had needed to was proof that the wraith now considered him a problem worth solving. The probe had failed, but the wraith did not forget a wall, and Harry knew, walking back to the tower, that he had bought time and not safety. The thing behind the turban would watch him now. It would move for the stone soon. It was already restless, already desperate, the unicorn blood keeping it alive but not whole, and when it moved, it would do so with one eye on the strange Potter boy who felt wrong. Even Dumbledore, high in his tower, began to make small notes. Nothing alarming yet. The boy was a model student, solitary but well-liked, brave by the evidence of a troll, gifted but not flagrantly so. But the architect had built a whole design around a particular kind of Harry Potter, a boy hungry for belonging, easily steered, ripe to be shaped into the weapon the prophecy required, and the boy in front of him was subtly the wrong shape. Self-possessed where he should have been needy, watchful where he should have been open. The instruments in the tower showed nothing wrong, but instruments measure what they are built to measure, and Albus Dumbledore had not built an instrument for a 40-year-old veteran wearing a child's skin, and so the architect was left with only the faint, persistent sense that one of his pieces was not sitting quite where he had placed it. Harry knew all of this was happening. He had expected it. The whole danger of his second life was the one he was living through now, that he could not act on his foreknowledge without his foreknowledge showing, that every divergence he made, the saved girl, the undug feud, the freed boy's wand, the rat about to be unmasked, sent a ripple outward, and that clever and patient enemies feel ripples even when they cannot see the stone. He was off the rails now. The timeline he had memorized had cracked in 4 places this autumn, and the cracks would spread, and the events of the coming months would not match the map in his head as cleanly as the siege in the alley had. He had traded the safety of a legible future for the power of an early one. He sat in the room of requirement on the last night of November, his core burning pleasantly at its new larger edge, his walls perfect, the diadem safe in its niche with his tripping thread across it, the letter to Amelia Bones somewhere in the ministry's slow machinery, and he took stock of the board the way he took stock of everything, cold, complete, without flinching. He had made himself stronger, faster than any first year had a right to be. He had located one of his enemy's hidden hearts. He had earned cleanly a friend who might never become a betrayer, and given another friend the wand that would one day make him formidable. He had set a quiet trap that might free the closest thing he had to family 12 years early, and he had, in doing all of it, begun to draw the attention of the three most dangerous minds in his world, the architect, the spy, and the wraith, none of whom yet knew what he was, all of whom had begun, in their separate ways, to wonder. The divergence was irreversible now. He could feel it. The first life's rails were behind him. Ahead lay a country no map covered, where the people he remembered would make new choices in response to Harry they had never met, and where his only true advantages were the ones that did not depend on the future matching his memory, his discipline, his power, his patience, and the cold, clear knowledge of exactly what each of his enemies wanted, and exactly how badly they wanted it. It was enough. It had to be enough, and as he let his wand light die and rose to walk back through the sleeping castle to the dormitory, Harry Potter felt, under the cold, something he had not felt in either life, the particular fierce calm of a man who has stopped running from the future and started building one. The stone was coming. The wraith would move for it before the year was out, exactly as it had the first time, and when it did, it would walk straight into a confrontation it thought it had designed and Harry had actually built. The first betrayer's move was almost here. He intended to be ready. He intended this time to be the one who set the trap. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, the first betrayer's move, the letter to Amelia Bones, landed in the second week of December, and it landed harder than Harry had dared hope. He learned it the way the whole school learned it, at breakfast when two Aurors in traveling cloaks walked the length of the great hall to the Gryffindor table, flanking a grim-faced witch with a monocle and a square jaw, and stopped in front of Ron Weasley, and asked, very politely and very firmly, to see his pet rat. The hall went quiet in patches, and then all at once. Ron, bewildered and going red, fumbled Scabbers out of his pocket, and the rat, which had survived 12 years on a survivor's instincts, took one look at the monocled witch and the drawn wands and understood, in whatever way a hunted thing understands, that the long hiding was over. It exploded out of Ron's hands in a gray blur and hit the flagstones running. It did not get far. Amelia Bones had not come to Hogwarts on a crank's letter without bringing people who knew how to catch a fleeing animagus. Two spells crossed in front of the rat, a third came down behind it, and the gray blur was caught in a net of light and hauled into the air, twisting and squealing, and then the squealing thickened and deepened and became a scream, and the rat unfolded, limbs lengthening, gray fur becoming gray rags, until a small, balding, sweating man hung in the net of light in the middle of the great hall with his hands held up and one finger missing from the right, blinking and gibbering, 12 years dead. "Peter Pettigrew," said Amelia Bones into the dead silence in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "Order of Merlin, first class, posthumous," her mouth twisted on the word. "Well, we'll be wanting that back." Harry watched it from his seat, an ordinary first year frozen in shock with everyone else, and he kept his face arranged in pure astonishment and let none of the savage satisfaction reach it. He had built this. He had built it left-handed on plain parchment 6 weeks ago and posted it from a village and let it go, and now it was happening in front of the whole school, the keystone pulled out of a lie that had cost an innocent man 12 years, and the man on the floor of the great hall was about to start talking, because cowards always talked, and everything that followed would fall like a row of stones. It fell fast. Pettigrew, caught and terrified and facing the Dementors of Azkaban, did exactly what Harry had known he would do. He tried to bargain, and bargaining meant talking, and talking meant the truth, that he, Peter Pettigrew, had been the Potter's secret keeper, not Sirius Black, that he had betrayed James and Lily to the Dark Lord, that he had blown up the street and cut off his own finger and framed Sirius and fled into a boy's pocket to hide. By the time the Aurors dragged him from the hall, he had confessed enough, in his blubbering panic, in front of 200 witnesses and the head of magical law enforcement, that the rest was paperwork. Up at the high table, Albus Dumbledore had risen to his feet, and his face, Harry watched this carefully, because it told him something, his face held a complicated grief. The old man had believed Sirius Black guilty for 12 years. He had testified in his way to that belief. And now in his own great hall in front of his students, the belief was being undone by a tip from an anonymous stranger, and Harry saw the architect's pale eyes move slowly across the Gryffindor table, across the shocked children, and rest for one long beat on Harry Potter, who was wearing exactly the same astonishment as everyone else and nothing more. Did he wonder? Harry could not be sure. There was no reason on earth to connect a first year to an anonymous letter to the DMLE. But Dumbledore connected things no one else could, and the timing was a thread, and Harry held his face perfectly still under the pale gaze and let the old man find nothing, and after a moment the eyes moved on. The aftermath took 10 days, and Harry spent them being an ordinary, delighted boy. Sirius Black's case was reopened. Veritaserum was administered to Pettigrew. The prophet ran the story across 3 days of screaming headlines: innocent man, black betrayed by dead friend, 12 years in AZKABN for another's crime, and the public mood swung as public moods do, from bloodlust to weepy sympathy. And on the 22nd of December, Sirius Black walked out of Azkaban a free man, pardoned, gaunt and gray and half-mad from the Dementors, but free, 12 years before the veil, alive. Harry did not write to him. Not yet. Sirius did not know this boy. A letter from his godson out of nowhere would be a strange and complicated thing to a man only just learning the sky again. There would be a time for that, a careful, earned time, when Harry could let one of his chosen bonds grow in the open. For now it was enough to know that the man was free and breathing, that the lever had pulled clean, that the death through the veil would never happen, because the man who would have died for Harry in the Department of Mysteries was instead sitting in a safe house somewhere, drinking fire whiskey and weeping and learning slowly that the world had turned without him for 12 years and turned back. It was the first betrayer's move undone, for Pettigrew was a betrayer, the original one, the man whose treachery had started the whole long catastrophe by handing Lily and James to their deaths, and Harry had undone it not with a wand but with a letter, cold and surgical and untraceable, and the satisfaction of it was real. But Pettigrew was not the betrayer the year had been building toward. That one still waited behind a turban, and it would move, as it always moved, for the stone. Hermione caught him in March, and Harry let her, because the catching told him something he needed to know. He had been disappearing for months, to the room, to the third-floor reconnaissance, to the owlery and the quiet corners where he did the work no first-year should be doing, and he had been careful about it. But Hermione Granger was the cleverest person in their year, and she had been watching him since a troll, and clever people who watch you notice patterns. She cornered him in an empty classroom on a wet Tuesday, shut the door, folded her arms, and said without preamble, "Where do you go?" "Library," Harry said. "You're not in the library, I'm in the library, you're never there." Her chin was up, the same chin she'd lifted at McGonagall. "You vanish 3 or 4 nights a week. You come back tired in a way that isn't normal tired. You knew where that troll would be. You can say you guessed, but you didn't guess, Harry, you knew. You answer Snape's questions like you've done them before. You're better at every spell than you let on in class. I've watched you hold back. And you got a letter out to the DMLE about Scabbers, didn't you? I worked it out. The timing and the way you weren't surprised and the way you watched the Aurors come in like you were checking a sum." She took a breath. "I'm not stupid. Stop treating me like I am. Who are you?" Harry looked at her for a long moment, and the cold plan said, deflect, reassure, give her a plausible story, hold the wall. He had a dozen ready. And he stood in the empty classroom with the rain on the windows and the cleverest of his enemies who might not be looking at him, with her arms folded and her chin up and no fear in her at all. And he understood that this was the test underneath all the tests, not whether she would lie to a teacher for him, but whether he could let one person see even a corner of the truth and trust them with it. Because the lesson he was circling toward all year was that a man who could never do that was a man already half built into the thing in the gallery. He did not tell her everything. He was not a fool, and the truth entire, the war, the courtyard, the cathedral, would either break her or get them both killed. But he gave her more than he had given anyone. "You're right about all of it," he said quietly, and watched her eyes widen at the bare admission. "I'm not going to tell you how, not yet. Maybe not for a long time, but I'll tell you this much, because you earned it, and because I'm tired of lying to the one person here clever enough to be worth not lying to. I know things I shouldn't, about people, about what's coming. I can't explain how without putting you in danger you can't imagine, so I won't, and you're going to have to decide whether you can stand being my friend without getting the answer to the most interesting question you've ever asked." He held her eyes. "I know that's a terrible thing to ask of someone like you. You want to know things, it's the best thing about you, and I'm asking you to be my friend and not know the biggest thing there is." The rain ran down the glass. Hermione Granger stood very still, and Harry watched the war happen on her face, the brilliant, relentless need to know, fighting the thing the troll had woken in her, the thing that put people over rules and answers, and he watched, with something he had not let himself feel in either life, which of the two won. "Is it dangerous?" she said at last. "What you know, is that why you go off alone? Are you in danger?" "Yes," Harry said, "and I'm handling it. I've handled worse." It came out before he could soften it, and he saw her catch the worse, saw her file it with everything else, and he let her, because she was going to know someday that this child had handled the worst thing there was. "Then you shouldn't handle it alone," Hermione said fiercely, and that, more than the lie at the troll, more than anything, was the moment Harry understood that she might never become the woman in the gallery. That's a stupid way to do anything dangerous, going off by yourself. You'll make a mistake no one's there to catch. I won't ask how you know things. I think that's mad, and I'll probably go spare wondering. But I'm not going to pretend I don't see you walking into something alone every week, so either you let me help or I follow you, and you know I'll do it." "I know you'll do it," Harry said, and something in his chest that had been clenched since a courtyard eased by a single degree. "All right. Not everything, but not alone either. I'll let you in on what I can when I can. That's the deal. Can you live with a deal that has edges you can't see past?" "No," Hermione said honestly, "but I can live with you better than I can live with watching you and saying nothing." She stuck out her hand, absurd and solemn, 11 years old. Deal. Harry shook it, and it was, he thought, the most important thing he had done all year, more than the stone, more than the wraith, more than the letter that freed Sirius. He had let one chosen, tested, earned person stand inside the edge of the truth, eyes open, on terms they both understood. He had taken the first real step off the road that ended in a gallery. The hat would have been pleased. Harry was, against the whole cold grain of the man he had been, pleased himself. He spent the spring learning the gauntlet from the inside, and he did it as he did everything now, quietly, completely, in advance. He went down to the third-floor corridor in the small hours, week by week, with the holly wand and a head full of memory, and he taught himself the whole of the stone's defenses before the night they would matter. He charmed Fluffy to sleep himself, 3 heads and all, an easy thing if you knew that music did it, and Harry brought a small enchanted music box and watched the monstrous dog slump into snoring while he studied the trapdoor beneath its paws. He went down past the devil's snare, which he relaxed with a precise warming charm instead of thrashing into a panic as he had the first time. He stood in the cold high chamber of the winged keys and noted the battered one that fit the door. He looked at the giant chessboard, white and waiting, and at the empty room where a troll had once been chained, and at the little chamber with the row of potion bottles and Snape's logic riddle, which he solved in his head in under a minute because he had solved it before and because the answer had not changed. He mapped all of it, and as he mapped it, he understood it freshly, with the man's eyes instead of the boy's. This was not a fortress, it was a stage. Every protection had a flaw a clever child could pass: the music, the warmth, the slow flying key. A chess game a first year could win, a riddle of pure logic, and the flaws were not accidents. Dumbledore had built a gauntlet that a determined 11-year-old could survive, and had then left the way to it dangling in front of the whole school, because the architect wanted the wraith drawn out into the open, and was entirely willing to use a child as the bait that drew it. The first time Harry had walked the whole stage on the last night, the unwitting trigger, and called it heroism. He was not going to be the trigger this time. He was going to be the playwright. He would not let Dumbledore's drama run with Harry as its puppet. He would arrive ahead of the script, take the final scene off the board before the headmaster's design could close around him, and leave the architect with a finished play he had not written and could not explain. The reconnaissance was the foundation of all of it, and he laid it patiently through the wet spring nights while the castle slept and his core grew, and Hermione, who knew he went now and had stopped following only because she'd extracted a promise that he'd come back and tell her he was alive, waited up in the common room with a book and a candle. The wraith moved in June, and Harry had been ready for it since Easter. He knew the sequence. He had lived it. As the year wound toward its end, the protections around the stone would seem to fail one by one. Quirrell would get past Fluffy with music, past the staff's defenses by cunning and the wraith's strength, all the way down to the final chamber and the Mirror of Eris, the last protection, Dumbledore's own, which would give the stone only to one who wanted to find it and not to use it. The first time Harry had blundered down through all of it on the last night, a frightened first year following a hunch, and had faced Quirrell at the mirror, and the touch of his skin had burned the possessed man to death because of the old protection in his blood, and the wraith had fled shrieking out of the ruin of its host. He was not going to do it that way this time. He was not going to be the headmaster's trigger, blundering down a staff-built gauntlet on the last night for the old man to find. He was going to choose the ground and the hour and the terms, and he had spent the spring building toward it. The key was the mirror. Harry knew what the Mirror of Eris did. It showed the deepest desire of the heart, and he knew the enchantment Dumbledore had laid on it, that only a person who wanted to find the stone but not to use it would draw it from the glass. It was an elegant lock. Quirrell, who wanted to use the stone, could stand in front of the mirror forever and only see himself presenting it to his master. He could never pull it out. The first time Harry had pulled it out because, in the purity of a child's panic, he had wanted only to keep it from Voldemort and not at all for himself, and the mirror had read that and dropped the stone into his pocket. Harry could do that again. But the stone in his pocket was a liability. Dumbledore would want it back, would know it had been moved, would ask questions Harry did not want asked. So Harry built a better plan, and the better plan turned the wraith's whole design against itself, and it hinged on a thing Harry had been quietly developing all year in the Room of Requirement, the door between the splinter in his scar and the wraith behind the turban. The connection ran both ways. He had confirmed it across months of patient, dangerous study, that the fragment in his head and the fragment animating Quirrell were the same severed soul, and that the link between them, which Voldemort had always used as a one-way window into Harry, could be pushed from Harry's side. He had practiced, carefully, never enough to wake the wraith's suspicion. He had learned to feel down the link, to sense the wraith's location, its hunger, its moods. And he had learned the most important thing of all, the thing that had cost him 100 careful hours, that the link was not just a window but a channel, and that what flowed through a channel could, by a strong enough will on the near side, be made to flow the other way. He did not intend to fight Quirrell at the mirror with spells. An 11-year-old's core, however trained, against the Dark Lord, even a Dark Lord reduced to a parasite, that was a fight Harry might lose, and Harry did not take fights he might lose when he could take fights he had already won. He intended, instead, to do to the Wraith what the Wraith had spent the year trying to do to him. He went down on the night he knew the Wraith would go, and he went down ahead of it. So on the warm June night when he felt, down the link, the Wraith's hunger spike and gather and begin to move, Dumbledore conveniently called away to London by a forged ministry summons. Exactly as before, the architect's own trap design playing out, Harry was already moving, already down through the trapdoor, already descending ahead of the thing that thought it hunted alone. He had told Hermione that morning plainly that tonight was the night and that she was to stay in the tower awake, and that if he was not back by dawn she was to go to McGonagall and tell her to check the third-floor corridor, and Hermione, white and frightened and furious, had agreed, because she had learned that arguing with Harry about danger was less useful than being the rope tied to his ankle. It was the first time in either life that anyone had known where he was going down into the dark. It steadied him more than he had expected. He did not go to fight at the bottom. He went to the bottom and past it to the final chamber, and he stood in front of the mirror of Arist in the cold torchlight and looked at himself for the first time in this second life. He had not meant to look. He knew what the mirror was. But it caught him the way it caught everyone, and for one unguarded breath Harry Potter looked into the glass and saw what his heart wanted most, and it was not the stone, and it was not power, and it was not even revenge. It was an ordinary afternoon. A kitchen he did not recognize, sunlight, the smell of something cooking. Sirius arguing cheerfully with someone out of frame. Hagrid filling a doorway. Neville, grown and easy and unafraid. Hermione at a table with a book, looking up to laugh at something. And no war, no courtyard, no cold at the base of him. Just a life, a plain, warm, unremarkable life among people who had chosen him and whom he had chosen back, none of them in a gallery, all of them simply there in the sun, with nothing trying to kill anyone. Harry looked at it for exactly 3 beats. Then he set it down because the want in the glass was a passenger and he was driving, and he turned the mirror's purpose to the work, because the want it had shown him was the truest possible proof that he did not want the stone to use, and the mirror, reading the heart that wanted only a quiet life among the living, gave up its secret to him at once. He felt the weight of the stone drop into his pocket, small and warm and red. He took it out, looked at it, the philosopher's stone, the flamel's life work, the thing the Wraith had crossed a continent and worn a man like a coat to steal, and then he did the thing he had come down ahead of the Wraith to do. He did not keep it. He did not destroy it. He set it back into the heart of the mirror with a touch of the will the enchantment answered to, so that the glass held it again exactly as before, untaken, waiting. And then he stepped into the shadows behind a pillar at the edge of the chamber, drew his occlumency walls up tight, and waited for his enemy to arrive at the trap it had built for itself. Quirrell came down into the chamber, unwinding his turban as he came, and the thing on the back of his skull turned to face the mirror, and Harry, from the shadows, looked for the first time in this life on the face of Voldemort. It was worse than memory. The flat snake-like features pressed out of the back of a living man's head, the red eyes, the slit nostrils, the awful wrongness of a face where no face should be, and the voice high and cold and clear, the voice that had ordered the deaths that started the war that ended in a courtyard. It set the splinter in Harry's scar burning, lining, straining toward its larger self, and Harry held it down behind his walls with everything he had and watched. Quirrell went to the mirror. He looked into it and saw himself presenting the stone to his master and reached for the glass and found nothing. He raged. He pawed at the surface. The high, cold voice hissed instructions, and Quirrell tried again and could not draw the stone because the lock read his want, and his want was to use, and the mirror gave nothing to a man who wanted to use. "It is in the mirror," Voldemort's voice hissed, frustrated. "I see it, I see myself holding it, but how do I reach it?" And then the cold red eyes, sweeping the chamber in fury, found the boy in the shadows. "Potter." Harry stepped out. There was no point hiding now. The moment had come, and he had chosen this moment, and a man who has chosen the ground does not cower on it. He walked into the torchlight in front of the mirror, 11 years old, his holly wand loose in his hand, and he looked at the ruin of the man who had murdered his parents and started his first death rolling, and he was not afraid, and the lack of fear was its own kind of weapon. "Hello, Tom," Harry said. The Wraith went very still. No one called him that. No one living knew to call him that, the slave name, the Muggle father's name, the name he had buried under the anagram and the terror, and to hear it in the high clear chamber from the mouth of an 11-year-old child stopped even Voldemort for a heartbeat. "You are not," the cold voice said slowly, "what you appear to be." "No," Harry agreed, "I'm not. You felt it all year, haven't you? The wall you couldn't get past, the boy who didn't flinch, you knew something was wrong and you couldn't name it." He took a step closer, and the splinter in his scar screamed toward its twin, and Harry let it because that was the plan that had always been the plan, the door swinging open from his side at last. Let me name it for you. I've been where you're trying so hard never to go. I've seen the place under the world where the hours are kept, and I came back carrying something you spent your whole life too afraid to carry." "And what," said Voldemort with the contempt of a thing that had been a dark lord, "is that?" "The truth that it isn't an enemy," Harry said. "You split your soul to 7 pieces to run from a thing that was never chasing you. And one of those pieces," he touched his own scar lightly, "has been living in my head for 10 years. Did you never wonder, Tom, why the boy who survived your curse could talk to snakes? Why his scar hurt when you were near? You put a piece of yourself in me. You made a door, and you only ever used it to look one way." He saw it land. He saw the red eyes widen, the first true alarm, the understanding arriving a half-second too late, because Harry was already through the door. He had practiced this for months on the diadem and the splinter, learning the channel, learning to push instead of only receive. Now he opened the link wide, all the way you throw open a floodgate, and he poured down it not a spell, not an attack the Wraith knew how to parry, but the one thing the Wraith could not survive contact with and had spent its whole existence fleeing, the truth of the cathedral, the cold under all colds, the floor under the floor. The patient, lightless certainty of the place where every hour was kept, finished and done, neither at peace nor in torment, only over, the death that was not an enemy because it did not need to be, that simply waited, that had already, in some sense the living could not hold one. He poured the floor under the floor down the link into the thing that had broken its own soul to 7 pieces rather than face it. Voldemort screamed. It was not a sound a living throat made. Quirrell's body convulsed, and the face on the back of his skull shrieked, the red eyes rolling because the Wraith, the fragment of a soul that had defined itself, wholly and forever, by the refusal of death, was being held, through a channel it had made itself, in direct contact with the absolute fact of death, the thing it had spent 50 years and 7 mutilations of its own soul running from. A whole person might have endured it. A torn shred of one, already half unmade, animating a borrowed body by sheer terrified will, could not. The contact was not pain, it was worse than pain. It was recognition, the fragment forced to see at last, the destination it had bent the whole world to avoid, and the seeing undid the will that held it stitched to Quirrell's dying flesh. The body collapsed. And out of the ruin of it, exactly as the first time but for an entirely different reason, the Wraith tore free, a screaming wisp of black smoke and red malice, fleeing the boy in the chamber and the unbearable cold truth that had reached down a door it thought it owned. It blew past Harry, through him, an icy shriek of hatred, and was gone up and out of the castle north, broken. A soul shard fled back to the forest to drink blood and hide and try, over years, to put itself back together. Quirrell was dead on the stone. The stone sat untaken in the mirror. And Harry Potter stood alone in the torchlit chamber, 11 years old, the holly wand still loose in his hand, having met the Dark Lord on ground of his own choosing and won without casting a single spell. He should have felt triumph. He waited for it, standing over the dead man, and it did not come, or it came thin and gray and tasted of ash, and he made himself stand in the empty chamber and understand why. He had won. That was real. The Wraith was driven off, weaker than the first time and far more frightened. Harry had shown it the one thing it could not bear, and it would carry that horror now into every year of its slow attempt to return, and a Voldemort who was afraid in his bones of the thing in Harry's head was a Voldemort handed a permanent wound. The stone was safe. Sirius was free. Pettigrew was in a cell. Quirrell was dead on the floor, and Harry had killed him, not with malice. The man had been a willing host, a weak, greedy soul who had opened his own skull to a monster, and his death had been the Wraith's tearing free, not Harry's hand. But Harry had set the trap and chosen the ground and opened the door, and a man was dead on the stone because of it. And Harry stood over the body and felt the old familiar weight settle onto him, the weight he had carried through the whole war and all the way to the courtyard, the weight of being the thing that wins and of what winning costs, and of how the people who cheer the victory are never the ones who have to stand alone afterward over the body in the empty room. This was the ash. He had forgotten in the cold, clean planning of his second life that winning had a taste, and the taste was this, the silence after, the body on the stone, the knowledge that he was very good at this, frighteningly good, that he had just outthought and outwilled the most dangerous wizard of the age at the age of 11, and that being that good was exactly the thing that had ended, the first time, with 200 faces in a gallery deciding he was too dangerous to live. He understood, standing there, the trap underneath the trap. The cathedral had sent him back to stop being a weapon. But he had just won a war's first battle by being a better weapon than he had ever been, alone in the dark, with no one knowing, and a man who wins his battles alone in the dark, however righteous, is a man building, brick by brick, the exact reputation that gets a person executed. He had sworn never to be the Sable again. And here he was, standing over a body in a hidden chamber, having done a thing more frightening than anything the Sable had ever done, with the same cold competence and the same complete solitude. The hat had warned him. The cold will keep you alive, and it will cost you everything you came back to save if you let it run you. But this time, and this was the thing that kept the ash from becoming despair, this time he had not been entirely alone. Up in Gryffindor Tower, a girl was awake by a candle with a book she was not reading, knowing where he had gone, ready to raise the castle if he did not come back. It was a small thing. It changed nothing about the body on the stone. But it was the difference between the sable who had won everything alone and lost everything to the people who watched him do it, and whatever Harry was becoming now, a person who had let one other person hold the rope. He held on to that. It was not much. It was the start of the only thing that mattered. He looked at the dead man and at the stone in the mirror and at his own reflection beside it, a small boy with a wand and old eyes, and he made a decision that was harder than any spell because it cut against the whole grain of the plan that had kept him alive. He could not keep doing this alone. Not because he would lose, he might never lose, that was the terrible part, but because the logical end of winning alone in the dark was the same courtyard by a different road. He had to let the winning be witnessed, shared, kept human. He had started tonight with one rope tied to his ankle. He would build from there. He left the stone in the mirror for Dumbledore to find and wonder over. He climbed back up through the gauntlet, past the chessboard and the keys and the snare, and he was gone from the third-floor corridor before anyone knew the wraith had moved. And at the top of the trapdoor a bushy-haired girl was waiting in the dark with her wand lit and her face white, because she had not been able to stay in the tower after all, and she looked at him, alive, unhurt, grim, and did not ask what had happened, only said, "You're back," in a voice that shook, and Harry said, "I'm back," and meant it as more than a fact. The next morning the school woke to the news that Professor Quirrell had died suddenly in the night, and Dumbledore returned from his false summons in London to find the stone safe, untaken, and an entire mystery he could not account for. Dumbledore came for him 3 days later, as Harry had known he would, because the architect could not leave a mystery in his own castle unexamined. It was done gently, as Dumbledore did everything, an invitation to the headmaster's office, sherbet lemons offered, the pale blue eyes mild and twinkling over the half-moon spectacles. And Harry sat in the chair across the great desk, an ordinary first-year summoned for an ordinary chat, and held his walls perfectly and waited. A strange end to the year, Dumbledore said, watching him. Poor Professor Quirrell. And a great deal of excitement besides. Mr. Black freed after all these years on the word of a stranger no one can find. A pause waited the gentlest possible probe. "You have had a remarkable first year, Harry, more remarkable, I think, than even you know." "I just did my homework, sir," Harry said, a boy's modest confusion. "And I was glad about Mr. Black. Hagrid says he was my dad's best friend." He was. The blue eyes did not leave Harry's face. It is a curious thing how the world rearranges itself around certain people. I have lived a long time, Harry, and I have learned to notice when events bend toward a single point, when a great many fortunate things happen at once, around one quiet child who claims to have only done his homework. He let it hang there, the whole of his suspicion offered in the kindest possible voice, an open door inviting confession. "Is there anything you would like to tell me?" And here was the moment, the one Harry had been walking toward all year. The architect, the patientest enemy, sitting across a desk and asking almost kindly to be let in. The first life's Harry would have crumbled, would have poured it all out, would have handed this man his trust on credit because the old wizard was warm and twinkling and called him my boy. And the cold plan said, give him nothing, hold the wall, be the pawn he expects for years yet. Harry held the wall. But he had decided over the dead man in the chamber that the cold plan carried to its end was its own kind of courtyard, and so he did a thing the cold plan had not called for. He looked the architect in the eye and he gave him one true thing wrapped where it could not be used. "Sir," Harry said quietly, "can I ask you something? When you put me with the Dursleys, when you decided where I'd grow up and who'd watch me and all of it, did you ever think about asking me about any of it?" He let a boy's honesty carry it, but he held the old man's eyes with something older underneath. "People keep arranging my life, my whole life, and I think they mean well, but nobody ever asks me. And I think a person can do a lot of damage, arranging someone's life for their own good and meaning well the whole time." It was not a confession. It gave away nothing of the cathedral or the war or the wraith. But it landed somewhere deep in Albus Dumbledore, in the place where the man kept his oldest griefs, the sister he had failed, the friend he had loved and lost to the same disease of arranging the world for its own good. And Harry watched the twinkle falter, watched something genuinely shaken move behind the half-moon spectacles, watched the architect hear, from the mouth of an 11-year-old, the precise indictment of his own life's method. "No," Dumbledore said at last, very quietly, and for once there was no twinkle in it at all. "No, Harry, I did not ask you. I have not, I think, asked anyone in a very long time. It is a fault I came to late and at great cost, and I am," the old voice was rough, "I am sorry that you have felt it." It was not surrender. The architect was not undone by a single conversation. He would go on arranging, go on watching, go on believing he knew best, because 50 years of habit did not break in an afternoon. But Harry had put a crack in the man, the same kind of crack he had put in Snape, in the timeline, in the wraith, a small true thing lodged where it would work slowly. And he had done it without giving away a single secret, and he had done it because the lesson of the chamber was that you did not beat the people who would betray you only by outmaneuvering them in the dark. Sometimes you beat them by reaching the part of them that did not want to be a betrayer, and making it harder, year by year, true thing by true thing, for them to become the person who stood in a gallery and looked away. He walked out of the headmaster's office into the summer light of the corridor, and the cold settled at the base of him, patient, lent, and he let himself feel under it the first thin warmth of something that was not triumph and was better than triumph. The sense of a road taken that did not end where the last one had. The first betrayer's move had come, and Harry had turned it against its author, twice over Pettigrew in a cell. The wraith fled broken into the north. But the deeper work of the year had not been the winning. It had been the discovery over a body in an empty chamber that winning alone in the dark was the seed of his old death, and that the only way to truly kill that seed was to stop being the kind of man who won that way. He intended to spend the rest of his second life learning how, starting now, starting with the people he had chosen, eyes open on his own terms. He went to find Neville and Hermione. The sun was out. The war was further off than it had ever been, and for the first time since the courtyard, Harry Potter walked toward people instead of away from them. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. His own terms. Harry went back for the diadem on the last night of the school year, and this time he meant to unmake it. He had learned how in the chamber under the third floor, though he had not gone down there to learn it. When he had poured the truth of the cathedral down the link into the wraith and watched the wraith come apart, he had understood something about what he was that he had spent 2 lifetimes refusing to look at squarely. He was the master of death, not a title, not a legend, not a thing he had won in a forest and then spent years pretending away, a fact, the same kind of fact as the floor under the floor. He carried the cold of that place at the base of him, lent, patient. And a soul fragment, a horcrux, was nothing but a scrap of a person nailed to the world in defiance of death, which made it of all things the single thing in creation most vulnerable to the one who carried death's own cold in his bones. He did not need a basilisk fang. He did not need the goblin-forged sword. He had needed those the first time because the first Harry had been only a wizard, and ordinary magic could not touch a horcrux. The second Harry was something else, and the second Harry had proven it on the wraith, and tonight he was going to prove it on the diadem. He walked into the room of hidden things at midnight with his wand light low and his occlumency walls high, and the towering aisles of forgotten junk rose around him in the dark, 1,000 years of what students had wanted gone. He found the bust of the ugly warlock and the dusty wig, and beneath it the tarnished diadem with its fragment coiled inside, exactly where his tripping thread told him it had lain untouched all year. He lifted it from the niche. It was the first time he had touched it in this life, and the moment his fingers closed on the cold metal, the splinter in his scar surged toward it, recognition screaming to recognition, the 2 severed pieces of one ruined soul straining to be whole across the inch of his skin. He did not let them touch. He held the diadem at arm's length and looked at the malice coiled inside it, a piece of a man who had broken his own soul 7 times rather than face the thing Harry carried, and he felt distinctly the fragment become aware of him, become afraid, begin to thrash inside its metal prison, hissing in a voice too small for words. "I know," Harry said quietly to the thing in the diadem. "You don't want to go. None of you ever do. He made you out of the not wanting. That's all you are, a scream that refuses to stop." And then he opened the channel as he had opened it on the wraith, and he poured the floor under the floor into the diadem. It was easier than the wraith had been. The wraith had been animating a living body, defended by a living will. The diadem was only the fragment, raw and exposed, and when the cold of the cathedral reached it, the fragment had nothing to hide behind. Harry felt it meet the truth, the patient, lightless certainty, the place where every hour was kept, the death that was not an enemy because it had already, in the only sense that mattered, won, and he felt the fragment understand, in the last instant, exactly what it had spent its existence fleeing, and he felt it stop. The diadem cracked in his hands. A thin black ichor wept from the broken metal and hissed away to nothing, and a high thin wail rose and thinned and was gone, and the cold metal in his hands was suddenly only cold metal, a tarnished old tiara with the soul gone out of it, and the splinter in Harry's own scar, which had been straining toward it, settled back into uneasy quiet. Harry stood in the dark holding the dead diadem, and he understood that he had just done a thing that, in his first life, it had taken the whole of the war and a dozen deaths and the loss of everyone he loved to accomplish piece by bloody piece. One of the 7 anchors unmade on a quiet night by a boy alone in a junk room, with no one hurt and no one dead and no one even aware that a war had a front in it. It was the most important thing he had done all year, and it was almost the easiest, and that was the whole shape of his second life in a single act. The foreknowledge, the patience, the power grown early in the dark, all of it converging so that the catastrophes of the first life became, in the second, quiet errands done well. 6 anchors left, the cup in the Lestrange vault, the goblins in time, on terms he was already negotiating. The locket in a cave by the sea, which he would retrieve when he was older and stronger and could survive the place that had nearly broken Dumbledore. The ring in the ruined gaunt shack, which was 2 things at once and which he had a particular and complicated reason to want. The snake Nagini, which was not yet a Horcrux and might, if Harry moved correctly, never become one. The splinter behind his own scar. And the wraith itself fled north, broken and afraid, trying to gather itself in the forests of Albania. He had a plan for all of them now, and the plan no longer ran through a war. It ran through years, patient, quiet, surgical years, in which Harry Potter would unmake the Dark Lord one hidden heart at a time, while the world went on believing there was nothing to unmake. By the time anyone understood that Voldemort had ever tried to return, Voldemort would have nothing left to return to. He had already begun the slowest of those threads. A letter had gone to the director of hereditary accounts at Gringotts in May, proposing, in the careful old register of obligation the goblins respected, a future arrangement. That when Harry came of age, he wished to retain goblin counsel in pursuing a claim against certain artifacts held in the Lestrange vault, objects he believed to be stolen goblin work corrupted by dark magic, which the bank might have an interest in seeing examined and cleansed. It was a seed planted in soil that would take years to bear, and it was deliberately vague, and it touched exactly the things goblins cared about: craft, theft, the cleansing of corrupted work, and the reply had come back cautious but not closed, which from a goblin was nearly enthusiasm. The cup would not be stolen this time in a screaming midnight raid that cost him the goblin nation's trust. It would be brought up into the light, in years to come, by goblin hands and goblin law, because Harry had spent his first handshake and his first year learning to be the rare wizard a goblin would do that for. He pocketed the dead diadem, Rowan a Ravenclaw's lost diadem, 1,000 years lost, which he would clean and quietly return to its house someday, because some things deserved to be given back, and he walked out of the room of hidden things into the last night of his first year with one anchor down and the cold settled and the long road clear in front of him. He retrieved his father's cloak 2 days later, and the manner of it told him a great deal about where he and the architect now stood. The first time the invisibility cloak had come to him at Christmas, anonymously with a note in a hand he later learned was Dumbledore's. "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." The old man had kept James Potter's cloak for a decade, had studied it, had recognized it for what it was, and had handed it to a boy at exactly the moment in the boy's life when it would be most useful for the headmaster's purposes. Even the gift had been a move. This time the cloak came in June, and it came with a difference. It arrived by school owl, wrapped in brown paper with a note in the same looping hand, but the note did not say "use it well." It said, "Your father left this in my keeping. I have held it longer than I should have, and for reasons that were more mine than yours. It is yours. I am sorry it took an 11-year-old to remind me that the things I keep for people's own good are not, in the end, mine to keep." A.D. Harry read it 3 times, alone in the dormitory, and then he sat with it for a while, and then he decided that a letter was not enough, that the thing he had started in the office needed finishing in person, face to face, before he left for the summer. He was not going to let the architect off with a written apology and a returned heirloom. Apologies on parchment were easy. He wanted to look the man in the eye and sever the claim cleanly, while the crack he had made was still fresh. He asked McGonagall to arrange it, and she did, with a curious sidelong look, and the next evening Harry climbed the spiral stair to the headmaster's office for the second time in a fortnight. Dumbledore was at the window when he came in, watching the sun go down over the grounds, Fawkes drowsing on his perch, the silver instruments turning and clicking on their spindly tables. He turned, and there was no twinkle laid on for the occasion this time, only an old man looking at a child with a wariness he did not bother to hide. "You asked to see me, Harry. That is rare enough to be worth my attention." A small gesture at the chair. "Sit, if you like." Harry did not sit. He stood in the middle of the round office, 11 years old, and he said the thing he had come to say. "I wanted to thank you for the cloak in person, and for the letter." He held the old man's eyes. "And I wanted to ask you to make me a promise." Dumbledore's white eyebrows rose. "A promise from me. You are a singular child, Harry Potter." He came away from the window and sat slowly behind the great desk and folded his long hands. "Ask, I will tell you honestly whether I can keep it." "Stop arranging my life," Harry said. The office was very quiet. Fawkes opened one eye. "I know you've been doing it since before I can remember," Harry went on level, a boy's voice carrying a thing far older than a boy. "Mrs. Figg, 3 streets over, who minded me and reported back to you. The Dursleys, who you chose and left me with, and never checked on the way you'd check on a thing you actually cared about rather than a thing you were keeping somewhere safe." The cloak, held back for the right moment. The corridor on the 3rd floor, with the deadly warning, dangled in front of the whole school like bait. "You've been moving me around aboard my whole life, sir, for reasons you think are good, and maybe they are good, and I'm telling you it stops now. I'm asking you to promise it stops." Dumbledore did not answer at once. The old face had gone still and grave, and behind the half-moon spectacles the pale eyes were doing something Harry had never seen them do in either life. They were looking at him without a single plan behind them, simply looking, the way a man looks at a thing that has just told him the truth about himself. "You understand," Dumbledore said at last, very quietly, "more than a child should. More, I begin to think, than is possible for a child to understand." And I find I am too old and too lately humbled to pretend I have not noticed. He drew a slow breath. You are right about all of it. I have spent a long life arranging the lives of others for what I was certain was the greater good. I told myself it was wisdom. I have come to suspect late and at great cost that it was something closer to fear, that I do not trust the world to come right unless I am the hand that sets it, and that this is not love, whatever I have called it, but a kind of grasping dressed as care. His voice roughened. I learned that lesson once before when I was young and a person I loved died of my certainty that I knew best. I had thought I learned it. It seems a lesson must be learned more than once. He looked at Harry and there was grief in it, and something that might have been the beginning of respect and something that was almost relief. I cannot promise you I will never again believe I know best, Dumbledore said. I am 11 decades into the habit, and a man does not unmake himself in an evening. But I can promise you this, and I will keep it. I will not arrange your life behind your back. I will not keep things from you for your own good and call it protection. If I believe I know something you should do, I will come to you and I will tell you why, and I will let you choose, even when I am certain you are choosing wrongly. I will treat you as a person and not a piece. That I can promise, that I will keep. A pause. It is more than I have offered anyone in 50 years. You have a way, Harry, of making a very old man feel he has been doing it all wrong. You haven't been doing all of it wrong, Harry said, and let one true thing into it, because the man had blinked, the architect had genuinely blinked, and a thing reached deserved a thing given. You loved people. You just loved them like a chess master loves his pieces, wanting the best for them and moving them anyway. It's a real love. It's just not enough on its own. I think you can learn the rest. I think it's not too late. Most people think it's too late for them about almost everything, and they're almost always wrong. Albus Dumbledore looked at the 11-year-old standing in the middle of his office, telling him, gently, that he could still become a better man, and the oldest and most powerful wizard in Britain put one hand briefly over his eyes, and when he took it away there was a brightness in them that had nothing to do with the twinkle he wore for the world. Go and enjoy your summer, Harry, he said, rough. And thank you. I do not think you know what you have done here this evening. I am not certain I do either, but I think it may turn out to be a kindness, and I have not been on the receiving end of one of those in longer than you have been alive. Harry left him there, an old man at his window with the sun going down, and he walked down the spiral stair knowing he had done the thing he came to do. He had severed the grooming claim openly to the architect's face, and the architect had not fought him. The hand that had moved Harry around a board his whole life had this once let go of the piece. It was not a guarantee. Habits ran deep and Dumbledore's ran 50 years deep. But the claim was broken in the open now, named and refused and apologized for, and a claim broken in the open was a thing that could not quietly reform in the dark the way it had the first time. He had not killed the architect, he had done something harder and better. He had reached the man underneath the architect and given him a reason to put the architect down. The Hallows were the hardest thing, because the Hallows were the thing that had made him what the gallery feared, and Harry had to decide, that summer, what to do about being the master of death. He understood them now in a way he never had the first time. 3 objects, the wand, the stone, the cloak, that the legend said made their possessor the master of death, and which in truth did something stranger and quieter than the legend claimed. He had the cloak now, his father's, the true cloak of the third brother, the one that hid you even from death. The wand was in Dumbledore's hand, one from Grindelwald, the most dangerous object in the world, and the one that had got every previous owner killed. The stone was in the gaunt ring in a ruined shack, set in gold beside a fragment of Voldemort's soul, the stone that called back the dead as shadows of themselves. The first time Harry had gathered all 3 by accident and chance in the slow turning of a war, and the having of them had been part of what made him the Order's weapon, the man who could not be killed, the master of death, the thing too dangerous to leave alive. The legend of the Hallows had been a stone in the avalanche that buried him. He could gather them again. He was already halfway. He had the cloak, and he knew where the other 2 were, and a colder version of himself would have set out to collect the set, because a master of death who actually held the 3 deathless things would be the most powerful wizard who had ever lived, untouchable, unkillable, beyond any courtyard and any tribunal forever. And that, Harry understood, sitting in the summer dark with his father's cloak across his knees, was the exact trap the cathedral had sent him back to escape. A master of death who gathered the Hallows to make himself unkillable was a man who had learned nothing, a man still running from the floor under the floor, still defining himself by the refusal of the thing that had, in the only sense that mattered, already won. It was Voldemort's error in a nobler coat. The whole horror of the Wraith was a soul that had broken itself 7 times rather than accept death, and a Harry who chained the 3 Hallows to his hand to make himself proof against death forever was, underneath the difference of intention, doing the same thing, refusing the cathedral, refusing the loan's repayment, trying to be the one creature in all the kept hours that never had to be kept. He would not do it. He decided it that summer cleanly, and it was the most important decision of his second life, more important than the diadem or the wraith or any of it. He would keep the cloak because the cloak was his father's and was a tool, and hid the living rather than cheating the dead. He would take the stone out of the gaunt ring when he went for that Horcrux, not to call back the dead, never that, the dead were kept, and it was an obscenity to drag their shadows up out of the cathedral, but to be rid of the Horcrux and to set the stone somewhere it could harm no one. And he would leave the Elder Wand exactly where it was, in Albus Dumbledore's hand, because the Elder Wand was a curse dressed as a prize, and the kindest thing Harry could do with the knowledge of it was to never, ever reach for it. He would be the master of death the way the third brother had been, not by conquering death but by greeting it in the end as an old friend and laying down the cloak and going with it gladly when the hour came. That was the whole secret the legend hid. The master of death was not the one who escaped it, it was the one who had stopped being afraid. Harry sat with his father's cloak in the summer dark and understood that he had, somewhere in this long strange year, stopped being afraid not of dying. He had done that twice now, but of the cold at the base of him, the lent thing, the mark of the cathedral had left. He had carried it all year as a debt to be dreaded. He understood now that it was not a debt at all, it was a reminder. The cathedral had not lent him a life on condition of repayment. It had sent him back, its master, with the cold pressed into his bones precisely so that he would not forget the one truth that could keep him from becoming the thing that died in the courtyard. That death was not an enemy, that the refusal of it was the root of every evil he had ever fought, and that a man who made peace with the floor under the floor was a man no tribunal and no dark lord could ever truly own. He felt the cold shift when he understood this. It was the only time it ever moved on its own. For one instant, at the base of him, the lent thing warmed by a single degree, not gone, never gone, but acknowledged, the loan accepted on both sides, the debt revealed to have been a gift all along. The attention, wherever it was, in whatever sense a thing with no before and after could be said to attend, registered that its master had finally understood the terms. There was no voice and no face and no sign a living mind could name. There was only, for the space of a single breath, the sense of a vast lightless patience turning its regard upon him once and finding, this time not a weapon to be spent and not a creature fleeing up the years with its memory clenched in both fists, but a man who had stopped running and being satisfied in whatever way a tide is satisfied with a shore, and turning its regard away again, back to the numberless kept hours, content to wait as it always waited. For the only appointment that is never broken. Then it settled back into its patient cold, and Harry was alone in the summer dark with his father's cloak and a clear road and a quiet mind, and the loop the cathedral had opened in a courtyard at dawn closed, gently, around a boy who was no longer going to grow up to need it opened again. He chose his bonds that summer, deliberately in the open, on his own terms, and the choosing was the last and best work of the year. He wrote to Sirius first, and then, when the careful letters had gone back and forth enough times to make it real, he met him. It happened at the start of August, in a sunlit garden behind a house in the country that the ministry had given Sirius Black as part of the apology for 12 stolen years, and Harry came to it the way he came to everything now, clear-eyed, prepared, braced for the gap between the man he remembered and the man who would actually be standing there. Sirius was thin still and gray at the temples too early, and there was a haunted flicker behind his eyes that Azkaban had put there and would never fully take away. But when he saw Harry come through the garden gate, his whole gaunt face broke open like a window thrown wide, and he crossed the lawn in 3 strides and stopped just short, suddenly shy, suddenly afraid, a man who had loved a baby and lost him, and did not know if the boy in front of him could be loved the same way. "You've got her eyes," Sirius said, hoarse. "Everyone'll have told you that. Lily's eyes. James is everything else, God help us, but Lily's eyes." His hands twitched at his sides as if he wanted to reach out and did not dare. "I'm sorry, I should have been there, I should have raised you." 12 years, I'm sorry, Harry, I'm sorry I wasn't." And Harry, who had carried this man's death on his chest like a stone through a whole war, who had watched him fall through a veil baited by a lie, who had come back through the floor under the floor and pulled a single careful lever to set him free 12 years early, Harry did the one thing his cold plan had never accounted for and never could have. He closed the gap himself, and he put his arms around the thin gray man, and he held on. "You're here now," he said into Sirius's shoulder. "That's the part that counts. You're here now." It was not strategy. It was not a tested, weighed, eyes-open extension of provisional trust. It was the one bond in all of it that Harry let himself have whole and warm and on credit, because some debts you pay forward without an accounting, and because the man weeping into his hair had died for him once and would never have to again, and because a boy who could not let himself be held by his own godfather was a boy who had let the cold win after all. They sat in the garden the rest of the afternoon, and Sirius told him about James and Lily, the real them, the loud and reckless and brave and ridiculous them, not the saints of the legend but the people, his mother who hexed bullies and his father who grew out of being one. And Harry listened and laughed and asked for more, and let himself simply be a boy hearing about his parents from the man who had loved them best. He gave nothing of the war, nothing of the cathedral, nothing of the cold. There would be a time, perhaps years off, when Sirius would have to know some of it, not today, Today was for the garden and the stories and the man who was alive, and Harry let it be exactly that, and it was the warmest afternoon of either of his lives. Hagrid needed no writing and no meeting. He would simply be there at the edge of every year alive, the first name on the short list, the one bond Harry had never had to think about at all. Neville he had already chosen, and the choosing had already paid out, a boy with his own wand now, his head higher, the force in him waking 2 years early. Harry would keep choosing him plainly the rest of the way. And Hermione was the one that mattered most, because Hermione was the one whose hand had been on the parchment, and Hermione was the one he had decided, against all the cold arithmetic, to unmake rather than outmaneuver. He had let her inside the edge of the truth in March. He had let her tie the rope to his ankle in June, and before they parted for the holidays on the platform at King's Cross with the steam rising and the family streaming past, he made her a promise, the only promise he made to anyone, and he chose his words as a man chooses the load-bearing wall of a house. "There's going to come a day," he told her, "when you have to decide whether something I am or something I've done is too dangerous to let stand. Maybe years from now. I can't tell you more than that. But it'll come for you specifically, because you'll be clever enough and brave enough to be the one who has to decide. And when it does, I'm not going to ask you to choose me over what's right. I'd never ask that. I'm only going to ask you one thing." He held her eyes. "Ask me first. Before you decide what I am, ask me. Don't do the calculation alone in a room and then act on it. Whatever it is, however bad it looks, come and ask me first. That's all. Can you promise me that?" Hermione Granger looked at him, 11 years old, with the rain-gray London light on her face and a question in her eyes she knew better than to ask aloud, and something in her understood that this was not a small thing, that the strange, grave boy who knew impossible things was asking her for the one promise that mattered most to him in the world, and that she did not need to understand why to know that she would keep it. "I promise," she said, "ask you first, always." And Harry, who had watched her hand on a parchment in a courtyard at dawn, who had carried the green light in the floor under the floor in the cold, and the whole long ruin of his first life back through the years to a cupboard in Surrey, Harry believed her. Not on credit, on a year of proof. On a troll and a rope and a chin lifted at McGonagall and a deal with edges she could not see past, kept faithfully through every one of them. He had not stopped the woman in the gallery by being colder than her, or cleverer, or faster to the trigger. He had stopped her by being there early with the truth in measured doses and his eyes open, and his trust extended exactly as fast as she earned it, by giving the girl a Harry who was a person and not a weapon, so that the woman she grew into would never have a weapon to weigh against a kingdom, only a friend who had asked her, once on a platform in the rain, to ask him first. The train had pulled out of Hogsmeade Station that last morning of the year, and Harry had sat in a compartment with Neville and Hermione in the green country flying past, and he had taken stock one final time as he took stock of everything, cold, complete, without flinching, but warmer now than it had ever been. The board had changed beyond any map. Pettigrew was in a cell. Sirius was free and writing letters full of exclamation marks. The Wraith was fled north, broken and afraid, carrying a horror it would never set down. One of the 7 anchors was unmade, and the rest were known, located, and scheduled for quiet years of patient destruction that would never become a war. Snape had not become an enemy. Dumbledore had become something Harry did not have a word for yet, something that might be an ally and might be a friend, and was, at the very least, no longer certain to be the architect of a courtyard. Neville had his wand. Hermione had her promise, and the cold at the base of Harry, the Lent thing, had warmed by a single degree and would never again be a thing he dreaded, because he understood now what it was and what he was, and the terms of the loan that had turned out to be a gift. He was not the boy who lived. That boy had grown into the Order's weapon, and the weapon had grown into a body chained to a ring, and the whole grinding chain of it had begun in a cupboard with a starved child learning to make himself small. He was not that boy, and he was not the sable. That was the thing the cathedral had sent him back to refuse, and he had spent the year learning the hard way over a body in an empty chamber that you could not refuse it by being a better weapon alone in the dark, because the better weapon ended in the same courtyard by a different road. The sable had won everything alone and been destroyed by everyone who watched. Harry was not going to be the sable. He was the third thing. Not the boy the world had made into a weapon, and not the weapon the world had decided to destroy, but a man who had been to the bottom of the world and come back and chosen, eyes open, on his own terms, against the whole grain of the cold that had kept him alive, to be a person. To win where he had to, but never alone in the dark. To trust where it was earned and never on credit. To make peace with the floor under the floor instead of running from it forever. To grow the things he could not control, and choose the bonds he could, and never again hand a single piece of himself to anyone who had not proven they would not one day decide to keep it. The whole long catastrophe of his first life had run from a cupboard to a courtyard, link by link, every link a moment when Harry Potter had given himself away to someone who would spend him. He had come back to break the chain at the first link, but he understood now that breaking the chain had never been the point. The point was building a different one, A chain made of bonds chosen instead of bonds owed, of trust earned instead of trust extended on credit, of a man who knew exactly what each person at the table was capable of becoming and chose, with both eyes open, which of them to walk toward anyway. The green country flew past the window. Neville was telling Hermione about a plant, and Hermione was correcting him, and Neville was holding his own with his new wand in his pocket and his head high. And the sun came through the glass and lit the three of them, and Harry Potter, 11 years old, 20 years dead, the master of death, the boy who had been executed by his own order and woken on the day he got his Hogwarts letter, sat among the people he had chosen and let himself, for the first time in either life, simply be where he was. There would be years yet, the wraith would gather itself, the anchors would have to fall, the world would turn in ways no map covered now, and there would be hard hours and cold ones and hours when the old discipline was the only thing that kept him standing. He knew all of that, he was ready for all of that, but the seed of his old death was dead. He had killed it not with a spell in the end, but with the slow, patient choosing of a different self. The boy in the cupboard who would have grown into the weapon in the courtyard was gone, unmade as cleanly as the diadem, and in his place sat a man on a train in the sun, going forward on his own terms, toward a life the mirror had shown him, and he had decided to go out and build. The cold settled at the base of him, patient content, no longer a debt and no longer a dread, only a reminder, only the truth he would carry the rest of the way, that death was not an enemy, and that the only thing worth being afraid of had always been the becoming of the thing too dangerous to love. He was not going to become it, not this time. He looked out the window at the future flying toward him, and Harry Potter smiled, and this time it was a nice smile, and it had everything to do with happiness, and it was the first one of its kind in 20 years. The train carried them south toward the rest of it. Chapter 7 end.